Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conference, Citizens Conference, 30 Years of German Unity, What's Next? This welcome extends, of course, to both the online audience as well as the people here in the room. My name is Florian Lippert. I'm Associate Professor for European Literature and Culture here at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And I'm also a member of the European project rEUnify, a comparative study of national perceptions regarding German reunification. The chair group will be introduced by the chair, Professor Pablo Valdivia, in just about 2 minutes. And then I will briefly present the program. And then the project rEUnify will be introduced in detail by my dear colleague, Dr. Iwona Reichardt. Before we come to all this, let me stress what a great pleasure it is to see that so many members of the audience have readily swapped to online participation. As many will be aware, we had originally intended this to be a hybrid event, meaning that people could participate both on-site and online. But due to reasons with which we're all too familiar, obviously, so health and safety reasons, the much quoted ones, we are now forced to conduct it in this constellation. That is, the members of the audience are participating online, and only the speakers and panelists and project members are here with us in the room. I'm stressing this once more because actually this is all about you, about the audience online. rEUnify is above all an outreach project, which is basically the fancy academic term for communicating and discussing academic research, in this case about societal matters, with the people who are concerned by it, in this case, society. So in this way, there will be the opportunity for you at home, or from wherever you're joining us, of course, to discuss with our speakers and panelists via the chat function later on, and we will also explain this, how it works a little later. So for now, let me just reiterate once more, welcome, and really this is about you. And with this, I hand over to my dear colleague and friend, Professor Pablo Valdivia, who's joining us online. He's chair of European Culture and Literature here at the University of Groningen, and he's also academic director of the Netherlands Research School for Literary Studies and associate in applied physics at the Harvard Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard University. Yeah, Pablo, thank you very much for joining us with your welcoming words, and I hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Dear participants, dear organizers, many thanks for counting me in at the opening of the rEUnify conference. Congratulations to the organizers. It is a pleasure and an honor to welcome you from the chair of European Culture and Literature, where my great colleague, Dr. Florian Lippert, is part of as vice chair and as one of our finest scholars. In this welcoming opening, I would like to especially highlight both, on the one hand, the solid international configuration of the rEUnify projects, comprising members from Poland, Czech Republic, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and also, on the other hand, the timely and topical relevance of the critical questions regarding contemporary Europe, the notion of Europeanness, its limitations, conceptualizations, and problematizations that the rEUnify projects address. In this regard, the research and societal scope of the rEUnify projects tie well with many aspects and lines of inquiry currently present in our chair. Such is the case of the NITIAS projects of our colleague Sinia Robe, in which European transitional memories are thoroughly studied, Christian Kirchmeyer's funded projects on European political micro-targeting, Alberto Godioli's MBO-VD funded projects about the complexities of freedom of speech and legal implications in Europe, and of course, the NIAS research funded group led by Florian Lippert on the politics of defamiliarization, the common and the strange in contemporary Europe. Without further delay, I would like to congratulate the organizers and all the researchers involved for what I am sure will be a very successful and fruitful event. At the chair of European Culture and Literature, we are delighted to welcome you. As always, we are very supportive of any events and activity that can enrich our scientific horizons. Many thanks, dear Florian Lippert, for all the fantastic work you do. And thank you all for your attention and time.
Thank you very much, dear Pablo. As Pablo Valdivia has already reminded us, this Citizens Conference is about both historical and contemporary perspectives on German reunification, and this both in a national, namely Dutch in this case, and in a European context. I myself had the pleasure to conduct some research on this matter together with my very esteemed colleagues, Professor Friso Wielenga from the University of Münster and Dr. Florian Lippert. But now let me just very briefly refer to some outlines of this research as a short topical introduction. In October 1990, the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung aptly summarized the impression which many Germans had at the time about their Dutch neighbors. Namely that the Netherlands were skeptical, sometimes even hostile towards German reunification. I quote from the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, "Holland finds it hard to say goodbye," namely to the division of Germany. However, this impression refers only to one side of the coin, as a closer look shows us. For the Netherlands, a convinced Atlantistic country during the Cold War, the reunification of Germany was not primarily a daunting prospect, as it was rather, for instance, at the beginning for the United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher. Rather, it was a both challenging and promising one, part of a development process which concerned above all the evolution of European integration. This integration has indeed been a leitmotif of Dutch-German relations, beginning with the demands of the then Dutch Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers in 1989 for, I quote him, "a European healing," and certainly not ending with the current Prime Minister Mark Rutte's laudatio on German Chancellor Angela Merkel and her European spirit when she received the Four Freedoms Award in 2016. In our article entitled "Caution, Concrete Utopias and Common Threats, Dutch Perspectives on German Unity in the European Context," which will be published in a special Reunify edition of the journal New Eastern Europe, on which, of course, my dear colleague who's coming after me will elaborate further. My colleagues and me present some of the main lines of this process since the events of 1989. One core observation is that the Dutch-German relations can be seen as typically European concerning both the partnership and the frictions between both countries, and also concerning the current common problems. While The Hague and Berlin promote Europeanness in many regards and act in agreement concerning many important lines of European policies, both countries also face massive challenges. Right-wing populist parties and also populist impulses in their own government policies, Euroscepticism, xenophobia, deepening ideological rifts within the populations. While the memory of German reunification is mostly addressed in the context of European integration and inclusion, it is occasionally also hijacked and misused for nationalist and populist purposes, as are other old ideas and ideals of European inclusion. The inner German debates about equality between East and West are as ongoing as the pan-European quest for a fairer, more humane, and more unified future. And in this context, I'm very happy to show you the program for today. If I would find the clicker, which had somehow disappeared. There it is. Yes, thank you very much. The program for today will, of course, pick up on many of these discourses, which I just really very briefly touched upon. So here we go. First, we will have my dear colleague, Dr. Iwona Reichardt, as already announced, who's Deputy Editor-in-Chief of New Eastern Europe and from the College of Eastern Europe, KEW, in Wrocław. She will, of course, present the framework project for the Citizens Conference. And after that, we are looking very much forward to our two keynote speakers, Professor Lars Rensmann, Chair for European Politics and Society at the University of Groningen, who will speak about Dutch-German relations from a political science perspective. Before Professor Jacco Pekelder, who is the director of the Zentrum for Niederlande-Studien at the University of Münster, will contribute with a historical perspective. Then, after a short break, we will come to our citizen panels, in which groups of citizens will present and discuss their memories of and perspectives on German reunification. And this part, to stress it once more, is of crucial importance to the Reunify project, as Iwona Reichardt will elaborate on. Last but not least, two of our very own students will present the results of a research project on the topic, on which they have worked together with their fellow students in one of our courses here at the University of Groningen. So a really full program, and let's start right away with it. It is my great pleasure that I hand over to my dear colleague, Dr. Iwona Reichardt from the College of Eastern Europe in Wrocław, who is Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the New Eastern Europe Journal and one of the leaders of the project Reunify. Dear Iwona, I hand over to you.
Florian, just the remote. Florian, thank you very much. Thank you for hosting us here in Groningen, and thank you to the University of Groningen for providing such a great venue to our meeting today. It is indeed great pleasure to have you, Florian, personally, and the University of Groningen as partners of this project. As I have been assigned the role to be a speaker who has to say a few words about this project, let me start by explaining to you why we gathered here in Groningen, arriving from our countries, from Poland, Czechia, and France, to discuss German reunification, which actually happened 31 years ago. So first, let's start with the date. As you are right to guess, we should have organized this event a year ago, which clearly marked the 30th anniversary of the German reunification. You are also correct to guess that we did not organize this meeting a year ago because of the COVID pandemic, and we had no choice but to move the conference and the whole project by the whole year, in fact. But the question is why we arrived from these specific countries. And to answer this question, I would like to quote a book which was published in 1992, so shortly after the reunification, titled Europe and German Unification by Renata Frisch-Borzangel. And here I quote, she writes, German unification changes essential parameters of the political landscape of post-war Europe based on division, the status quo, and opposing alliance systems. The new all-German polity must be fit into the newly emerging configuration of the old continent in such a way that it is felt by its neighbors and by the other powers involved within Europe to be a factor of stability, not for uncertainty. That is why, 30 years old, as German neighbors, we have formed a team of institutions to look into the recent history and its impact on our state and Europe as a whole. That's why I would like to now introduce to you these partner institutions who are here with us today, either on site or online, and they include our Czech partner is an independent think tank, Europeum. It focuses on European integration process, and it's represented by Yanniek in our project. The French partner, Eurocreative, is a French NGO represented by Roman, who is with us here today. The Dutch partner is, of course, our host today, the University of Groningen, represented by Florian in our team. The Polish partner I happened to have the honor to represent is the College of Eastern Europe based in Wrocław, and we represented together with my colleague Adam Balcer, who is actually the mastermind behind this project and our program director. We also were joined by another partner institution from Poland, the Jagiellonian University from Kraków, where our partner is Professor Kinga Gajda and her students. And of course, the German partner, the Institute for Europäische Politik from Berlin, and Simona Klee, who is with us today online. So as in this partnership of international institutions from our member states, we have started working on a project which we titled Reunify, a comparative study of national perceptions regarding German reunification. And we have planned a few activities and outputs, and they include research, which Florian already talked about. We are working with our national scholars on the publication of articles, which we'll put collectively in the issue of New Eastern Europe, where we will present this multi-angle, multi-dimensional perception of the reunification of Germany and its impact on today. This publication is envisioned for spring 2022, and hopefully we will be able to present it during our conference in Poland. We also, a part of our project is memory extraction and collata of data by younger generation. And here we are all working with the youth groups, either university students or high school students, on preparing an academic poster from their national perspectives. And here I would like to congratulate the University of Groningen and the students for being sort of the champions in this part of the project, because I have to tell you that your poster is being sort of an inspiration, a slide for the Polish group of students who are working under the leadership of Kinga Gajda and have just started working on their project, on their poster recently. And here I would like to show you the Polish team once more. Once more. Okay, maybe. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Maybe it's the wrong hands. Thank you, Florian. So the Polish team is saying hello as they have had their first meeting to discuss the project. All these posters will be presented in the end during our conference planned in Dresden to the German public and available on our websites for you to review. And the last part, but not less important, are the citizens' conferences like the one we are organizing today. We have planned a series of these conferences in our partner states and are organizing them with partner institutions to look into the question of German reunification from our national perspective, but also to confront it with perspectives of other member states as well as Europe as a whole. Today's conference is the second one organized, with the first one being in Berlin, the third one planned for Poland, Kraków. But in addition to all of these activities, I have to say that we have developed a really unique and full of good energy team of researchers, project managers, and partners. And I hope that this partnership and friendship will last even after we submit our final report to the European Commission. Before I hand over the floor to Professor Lars Rensmann, I would like to share just a few words with you today why I think this project is so important for us today, and why I think it is also important that the institution I'm representing, that is a Polish institution, is its leader. So as we all know, 30 years on since the reunification of Germany, we can see that, and what we discussed in Berlin, it has brought both positive and negative consequences, and it remains an issue in German politics and memory that is still not free from controversies and mixed assessments. However, I do find it extremely important that a country I represent, that is Poland, continues to see the good in this event. And by this good, I mean a change in the European landscape in the form of stability and greater certainty, as I quoted before. Above all, this good came in the form of German reunification, but also European reunification, which was the fruit of the work of the previous generation and which we now have the privilege to enjoy. And to be honest with you, I am deeply ashamed that the government of my country is no longer recognizing this good and is now trying to ally with those who do not provide neither security nor stability, nor, as this is what I stress the most, the further strengthening of the integration process. But as saddened as I am by the scenes broadcast by the Polish television, on which I see Marie Le Pen, together with Viktor Orban and Jarosław Kaczyński, meet together in Warsaw to discuss what we interpret as disintegration of Europe, I'm equally or even more rejoiced to be here with you today and to show you this on the screen, Kinga's team working on their part of the project, and it gives me the greatest hope that the fruit of German reunification and more broadly European reunifications are not going to be lost, but it's only for a short moment that their value is not appreciated by all. Thank you very much.
So we're making progress. The clicker is still here. Thank you very much, dear Iwona. I would now like to introduce our first keynote speaker, an icon in the field of contemporary political science, Professor Lars Rensmann, who is full professor and chair of European Politics and Society and director of the Research Center for the Study of Democratic Cultures and Politics here at the University of Groningen. The title of his lecture is Divided We Stand, Lingering East-West Cleavages and Germany's Relations to the Netherlands 30 years after the fall of the wall. Dear Lars, thank you so much for joining us here today, and I hand over to you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very, very much, Florian, for the invitation, and thank you very much. I'm pleased and delighted to be here today. Also, thanks to you, Iwona, for your moving words right beforehand. I think that's a good beginning of this conference already. I have to also note that, of course, when we're talking about German-Dutch relations in particular, after 30 years onwards, Florian and I are both scholarly embodiments of German-Dutch relations as scholars who are working and researching and teaching here in the Netherlands, in the Northern Netherlands in particular. What I will focus on, in fact, is not just the German-Dutch relations, but of course I will talk quite a bit on inner German relations. And this is also because I want to make ultimately a case, but I don't put my hypothesis first. I'll put my hypothesis at the end of this talk, and you'll soon know why. So in my first segment, I will talk about inner East-West cleavages within Germany, the divisions within Germany. Of course, there are multiple divisions as to there are multiple divisions and interests in Dutch society. There are multiple divisions in German society, but one striking division is this territorial division, the division that is still lingering on political, culturally lingering on between East and West Germany. What they call in Germany die Mauer in den Köpfen, the mental wall that Germans still to some extent uphold vis-a-vis these different political, cultural, and historical trajectories. Now, to start out with, and after this I will talk about German-Dutch relations and then offer my hypothesis at the end. 69%, it's noteworthy, we're talking about 30 years after unification, 69% of West Germans and 74% of Germans living in the East agreed to the statement, even 30 years after the fall of the wall, the differences between the East and the West are still very big. And this is a statement or data I'm countering when people say like, well, there are lots of regional differences in Germany, just like in the Netherlands, you know, Maastricht, what do we share the Northern Netherlands with the South, or with Holland, and or what do Bavarians share with Northern Germany? You will not find data like this. You will never find data like this where the differences are so striking that 2/3 up to 3/4 of the population would say like these are big, big differences. Even let's say Bavarians in Lower Bavaria wouldn't say that. 70% of East Germans think that only the West has profited from unification, whereas 30% of West Germans think only the East German profited, while 68% think Germany as a whole profited from unification. Here you see already a gap, right? You basically said everyone says like we benefited from the unification, but the differences are still vast, big, considerable. So what we see is, particularly in this East-West relationship, the country remains deeply divided. And even though in various aspects these divisions have been reduced, I'll talk more about the intergenerational process here, some other of these divisions are actually of this, what I call a multi-layered political divide between the East and the West, have to become even more robust. For example, in two different party systems. So we really have basically a very large support for the Alternative for Germany in Eastern Germany. We have considerably less support for the Alternative for Germany in the West. It's a strikingly, even though the numbers of parties are the same, the voting patterns are dramatically different. I'll show you a few graphs in a moment. There's a widely shared sentiment among Eastern Germans that they are second-class citizens, that they have been occupied by Western Besserwessis, those who think they know better over the last 30 years. And these sentiments have not dissipated. They're like very strong, alive and kicking. And so feeling, you know, a lot of Eastern Germans really think that they're not really masters of their own political destiny. This is like kind of, this is why the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the party can also mobilize on exactly this topic. Let's do a revolution 2.0, because the one in 1990 was not, 1989, 1999 was not successful, was not completed. And we need a second type of revolution. So on the other hand, many in the West, of course, are frustrated with that. And there's a kind of mirror image that Westerners often see Aussies as somewhat backward-oriented, underdeveloped, with a separate sense of identity, who really lament their fate instead of being grateful for what happened. We see that actually people are grateful. A large majority of East Germans is grateful. However, the skepticism towards this kind of Western occupation is seen as something ungrateful, and some portray in the extreme right as a problem of Saxony, which is a problem of Saxony, but of course is not exclusively a problem of Saxony. And so there are different political cultural perceptions that become also manifest in different voting behavior that express a persistent political divide that we have, particularly between the East and West. Now, this has been recently reinforced, what I call the Corona divide. In the Corona divide as an effect and factor, we have a very low vaccination rate in Germany compared to other countries, only around 70%. It's frustrating. It's subject of a lot of political controversy and discussion today. But we do see there's a divide, and another East-West divide, because less citizens, German citizens, are vaccinated in the East, considerably less so in Saxony. And Thuringia, but also Saxony, they have the lowest vaccination rates in Germany. Bavaria is not far behind, but still, it's you know, you see a real difference here once again. And political mobilizations of the Corona crisis feed into this broader, more widely spread anti-government and anti-elite skepticism that is present in the East, and that can also be explained historically due to the fact that for most of the 20th century, people living in the East have been subject to authoritarian dictatorships and felt like, you know, we cannot trust the elite because there is no democratic elite. And this sentiment is lingering on and feeding. It translates, as I said, into different voting patterns. People are dramatically voting more for the AfD. They've also been historically voting more for the left party, so two, the right-wing and left-wing populist parties in the East that are nurturing anti-elite sentiment. In both cases, really a sharp demarcation between you know, the Eastern, you see like you really can, with this map and many of these other maps, political maps, you see basically the wall is still there. You see, like when you look at the colors, the voting patterns, you see the wall. It's exactly these 5 states that look different from the others. So basically, it is the fact that when we look at attitude surveys, public opinion surveys in Eastern Germany as compared to Western Germany, there is much more of a skepticism towards liberal democracy in the East. There's a more what we call an instrumental relationship towards democracy in the East. Is democracy delivering me certain goods? If they're not delivering these goods, I don't believe in it. I don't believe in democracy as a principle, but rather as something that delivers. If it doesn't deliver, you know, screw it. So there's more shared sense of that. And that is typical not just for Eastern Germany, it's actually typical for all countries and states in the Central Eastern Europe. So we also see that in Poland, we also see that in Hungary, we also see that elsewhere, this instrumental relationship. We also see from a public service and public opinion that East Germans are tend to be less liberal cosmopolitan and more supportive of collective identity conceptions than their West German counterparts. And that has to do to a large extent, of course, with this kind of historical legacy and trajectory with democracy, liberalism, pluralism, and the exposure to cultural diversity political cultural experience over many decades. So if you compare 1970s Germany with 2020 Eastern Germany, you will have rather similar results. But so there is still a divide, and that has to do with developments over democratization processes over time. And all of that underpins a certain nostalgia, a more widespread rejection of social value change and self-expression values in the East. East German citizens are also strikingly much more favorable to redistributive policies, with this, considering this heritage of socialism and state interventionism. That's a very robust finding when controlled for economic status, that people are favoring that the state intervenes in the economy. Quite different from white shed sentiment in the Netherlands, by the way. So that is even, the contrast is even sharper there. East Germans are heavily in favor of a regulating state, while at the same time they have anti-government sentiments. This is kind of like, you're basically, you don't trust the government at all. There's a corona dictatorship that's a widespread notion. At the same time, however, there is the wish to have a more interventionist government economically. So the often failing complex experience with economic liberalism, this is here a key point that it's not my idea, it's actually raised by several scholars. The experience with economic liberalism, as so far as economic liberalism didn't deliver the goods to East Germans, is confused and fused with a skepticism towards democracy. So as long, and this can be explained, of course, by this instrumental relationship, if society doesn't deliver these goods, if citizens feel still also economically second class, if they don't have jobs or satisfying jobs, if they cannot fulfill their life expectations, they ultimately say, okay, this is the result not just of democracy, but actually it's a liberal democracy, and part of liberal democracy is economic liberalism. So if economic liberalism fails, it also harms the support of democracy as a set of institutions, which of course we need to disentangle, because economic liberalism is not democracy, right? But that is the perception. The democratization of political cultures then in the end is, and that's what I indicated when we look at data surveys from 1970s West Germany, it always is a long and winding and conflictual process that takes over generations. And it also includes backlashes. So a lot of the democratization argument that I'm making right now, or the discussion about the East-West divide, can be applied to the larger Central Eastern European context. It's the expectation of scholars in the 1990s that this is just an easy path. Democratic revolution, peaceful revolution, velvet revolution, and now we all happily arrive at the liberal democratic telos. That was, an expectation that really is not backed up by social science data. So to back this up with a few graphs before I move to the relationship between Germany then and the Netherlands, or Germany as a whole and the Netherlands, we see in this kind of cultural values and divisions among West and East Germans that, for example, as I kind of argued here with this liberal support of liberal cosmopolitan views, that more East Germans have an unfavorable opinion of Roma, Muslims, and Jews than West Germans on average, that more East Germans think or disagree that that democracy is the best form of government. So in East Germany, 42% say yes and 23% say no. That's a relatively strong segment, and a lot of those who are skeptical of democracy as a governing principle are, of course, then translating into votes for the alternative for Germany. Whereas in Germany, only 10%, in West Germany, only 10% think that. And when it comes to the market economy, I already said, belief in state interventionism in the economy. In West Germany, 48% say that there's no better system than market economy, whereas in East Germany, only 30% say that. A lot of them are undecided. So we see all these kind of divisions. We see, of course, still lingering on, even though there's been substantial East-West migration among German citizens, we see considerable differences when it comes to migration background. Only 11% in East Germany, including Berlin, diverse city of Berlin as a whole has 11.9% of migration background, whereas in most other regions, northern, western, southern Germany, it's around a quarter of the population. Striking difference in terms of multiculturalization and actual cosmopolitanization of societies. So once again, back to this kind of expectations, 71% of East Germans do answer yes to the question, if you remember your hopes you had in relation to unification. So this applies to these older generations. Have they been fulfilled? 71% do say yes. So there is this kind of still think we are better off. It was the right thing, but it wasn't really fully fulfilled. It wasn't really totally completed. It was like the second step is somewhat missing. Similarly, 70% of East Germans consider themselves as winners rather than losers of unification. Yet still. The life satisfaction in Germany, as we can see in the process, has been converging over time. Majorities in former West and East Germany now rate their life satisfaction highly. So we see here also this dramatic increase among East Germans. So all of that are good news. And the good news that I'm telling, while I'm insisting that there is a massive political divide, and maybe even more than other scholars, is that ultimately there is also a process of convergence. And there's particularly a process of convergence throughout generations. So when you ask older citizens, you have much more negative attitude, or more the divisions are much more emphasized than when looking at younger generations. And younger generations are moving around much more freely, and they by and large don't take these divisions as seriously or as important, don't consider them as important for their lives anymore. However, what we do see is a lingering economic, what we call, or I call an invisible economic wall that is still there. Despite this gradual balancing of standards of living, despite the fact that many say, yes, my expectations have been by and large fulfilled, and the standards of living and income and prosperity actually have been growing and improving so much in the East that they are converging towards the West. It's on the process. Still, 30 years after the wall, we do have significant economic gaps between both the East and the West, and that reinforces the sense of being left behind, a sense of being discriminated, a sense of being second-class citizens. I'll show you one of these more critical data and graphs on that as well. The average income and wages in the East still remain significantly lower. Unemployment remains higher in the East. Job opportunities remain more limited. In the East, there's also a larger segment of the population that is poor and detached from economic development. And exactly those, frustrated, economically frustrated voters also tend to vote for the AfD. Here, once again, we see a wall that is based on per capita GDP that is higher in former West German states than in former East German states. Even what we considered like the poor north, you look at Schleswig-Holstein in the north, or you look at the Saarland, poorer sections of Germany, they're still considerably higher than in all former East German states, the average income. This is an invisible economic wall. Let me just continue here. So that translates, of course, into monthly disposable household income that is considerably different. So once again, the expectations to some extent economically have been fulfilled, but at the same time, the gap is visible. It's not just a class gap that you have in society as a whole. It's a class gap that can be territorialized to some extent. On top of that, there's a sense that we see another wall here, that the East Germany is, of course, Schleswig-Holstein is not doing so well. It's shrinking. Schleswig-Holstein is so beautiful at the coast. You wonder why people are leaving, or the population is shrinking. But it's only minimally shrinking. The shrinking is much more dramatic in Eastern Germany. That has to do, of course, with economic opportunities and these dimensions. I wanted to show you a few other things you probably have never heard, and that is also feeding in this kind of sense of division or a divide in relation to the question of power. How much power do we have as East Germans? Yes, well, we had Angela Merkel. She was from East Germany, right? We have some power. Well, okay. fair enough. But look beyond Angela Merkel, it doesn't look so rosy, really. So there is actually some a justified argument about grief, for grief among East Germans. No DAX 30 corporate headquarters is in the East. Only one MDAX in Thuringia, 49 in the West, leaving Berlin aside as the capital. Despite Merkel, East Germans remain underrepresented in positions of political leadership. We have now 2 in the new government, newly formed government. But once again, Bundestags members, they have less of an Eastern German background than compared to the general population. 17% of the general populations are from the East, who can be classified from the East. Now, this is something I want to show you because we are in an academic context here. The cultural and academic elite is still largely Western. So basically, even Eastern German universities are governed by mostly West German professors and educators and presidents. 0 of the university and higher education presidents have an Eastern biography. That's true for all Germany. So that's a great number. You know, it's easy to remember. 0. Overall, East Germans hold only 1.7% of top-level leadership position everywhere in administration, politics, and society. This is also the sense like we are not represented here in the entire political system. Another graph, big companies, a big East-West divide. And of course, all of that has been exploited, reinforced, re-enhanced by parties, by agents of discontent. I mentioned particularly the Alternative for Germany, which exploits these socioeconomic and political cultural divisions quite effectively in their campaigns, in their slogans. Also, the Left Party for a long extent has kind of appealed to this sense of particular Eastern identity, emphasizing Eastern citizens' alleged discrimination, sometimes real discrimination by Germany's Western political elite. And these actors have to help translate these lingering resentments and disenchantment, and some of that, as I've shown objectively, in a significant political rage that we see in these political divisions playing out today. Now let me, so we have enough time for a discussion, let me spend a few minutes on a different type of divide. As you've seen, like there is a massive divide within Germany, the relationship between Germany and the Netherlands proper, which I call a still complicated relationship as well. Now one thing is, of course, it has already been mentioned, there's a large shadow even when we talk about 1990 Europeanization, healing, right? The term healing, it is because of the shadow of the Nazi past. And this shadow is a long shadow. It's a long shadow over the entire history of the post-war relations between Germany and the Netherlands, and of course, Germany and the whole of the continent. There is the memory, the vivid memory of Nazi terror and resistance, of mutual resentments that were fed into from this, that was inherited over generations. So that you hear even some years ago from an older person, you hear a German on a train that might cause some kind of anxieties or negative comments. Now, of course, it has to be said, a lot of things have changed also in the public view of these events, because initially there was a long initial and long lingering national myth-making after World War II in both countries that was really conflictive, and that kind of fed into these resentments. Because on the one hand, Germans falsely portrayed themselves as largely the victims of Hitler. There was this Austrian from Braunau at the inn, basically conquering Germany. Maybe a few collaborated, but we really, we were been subject to a dictatorship. What could we do? Whereas in the Netherlands, there was the strong narrative of a resistance nation. We are nations of resistors. And that was also a false narrative. And it turned out to be over years and years that, how false this was. When you think of like how museums were constructed in the sense like feeding this resistance nation narrative. When you look at the real data, I did some research on that and presented on a conference that a year ago in Rome, actually now it's before Corona, 2 years ago, that showed actually that it was a tiny minority of Dutch that resisted and a vast majority that collaborated actually with the Nazis. And there was a history predating the support of the Nazi parties and Nazi ideology within the Netherlands, even before the Nazis seized power and conquered the Netherlands. So some of these myth makings have been shattered over time. They've been particularly shattered since 1990, since in the last 30 years. This was a arduous process of historians, of intellectuals to shatter myths, both, of course, in Germany as well as in the Netherlands. And that has benefited ultimately also the understanding, the mutual understanding between these two countries. So anti-German and anti-Dutch resentments dating from this history are still there, but they're fading over generations, and they are not salient anymore longer among millennials. Notwithstanding that, of course, when it comes to football, that's a different ballgame, literally. On the political and economic level, the Netherlands and Germans are among the closest European partners. That is something we need to keep in mind. People from Germany are not just moving here to teach at Dutch universities, but actually they're coming to visit, they're coming to, the exchange is actually alive and kicking, growing. The only lowering here number is the Corona crisis. So that's not that the Germans stopped traveling to the Netherlands because they don't like the Netherlands anymore, but actually it's because of the Corona crisis. Netherlands is always top among the trading partners, and this is kind of varying. You see how close they are. Sometimes they are, when it comes to import and exports, even ahead of a country like China. Or the United States. This is quite impressive. Of course, we're neighboring countries, but it's still impressive considering that's a small country. Then you look at the level of economic exchange, it's almost really like one country. It has to be said. It's an enormous intertwinement of economic relations between the Netherlands and Germany. And for Germany, also the Netherlands is the major trading partner. Imagine that, Germany, this super big export country, the Netherlands is in some statistics, going up and down over the last years. It's on par with the United States and China, which I found really, truly impressive, I have to say. Now, notwithstanding the Corona crisis, this Dutch-German border and the sense of border and the sense of division has never been more transparent and transmissive than it is today. Yes, it was closed down at some time or reduced during the Corona crisis, but this border and the boundaries and the borders economically, culturally, and socially enormously transmissive, and particularly this is a development that actually happened after unification. So in longitudinal perspective, there's increasing number of German students and academics at Dutch universities, and also vice versa. That is also a part of this kind of, let's say, overcoming of divisions and unification process between the Netherlands and Germany. What remains is still profoundly different policy regimes and concerns about that. How do we deal with European issues? How do we deal with social welfare? How do you deal with economic redistributions? How do we solve the housing crisis in Groningen and the Netherlands and in Germany? What is the role of social and individual responsibility? There are still divides that are noteworthy also in survey data, but ultimately there's a very strong process of convergence and approachment. So in conclusion, so that we have a few minutes to debate my talk and have Q&A, the times they are changing. There are porous boundaries, there are transmissive boundaries, both, of course, increasingly within Germany and the Netherlands. They're much smaller, considerably smaller than 30 years ago. However, and there's a significant social value and generational change we see in both younger Dutch and East German generations. Younger cohorts are less likely to emphasize the legacies I talked about. They're less likely to emphasize divisions and the problems that divide us. So this is a lot of hope. But yet, despite of these cosmopolitanization effects that we see in both of these divisions I talked about in Germany and the Netherlands, political, cultural, and socio-economic and policy divides and mutually negative perceptions remain. They are resilient, and divisions, however, are less politically relevant in charge today than, and here's my big hypothesis for the discussion, between the Netherlands and Germany, notwithstanding all the different cultural heritages, than the divisions within Germany. So that's the food for thought I want to end up. I hope this was evident throughout my talk, that I see more problems within Germany in this sense than in the relationship between Germany and the Netherlands as we are here today and as we look into the future. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, dear Lars. Now, as Lars has already indicated, there is time for questions, both for on-site and online audience. The on-site audience has it slightly easier. You can just raise your hands and I will come visit you with my microphone. For the online audience, it's also no big deal, really. You just go to the lower right corner of your screen, click on the speech bubble, and then you can type your question in the chat. My dear colleague Stein van Hussen will then moderate the chat and read out your questions to Professor Lars Rensmann. So who would like to start? First question or comment? If I cannot see you, just speak up, please. We are surrounded by screens here in the studio, so we cannot see everyone on site. Yes, there's a question to my right. I hand over the microphone.
Thank you very much, Lars, for a very enriching presentation that confirmed many things that I thought all along, but didn't have the data to put into the picture. But it's a kind of sad ending, isn't it? And I like happy endings. So can I ask you to, spin the tale a little further and think about, I mean, if I were a fairy and it's Christmassy, so if you could make a wish for the future, and if you could, think about initiatives that could use the lessons perhaps that we have from obviously good relations and productive relations between the Netherlands and Germany, and maybe translate that back into inner German processes and maybe get the stagnation to break up a little bit.
Well, of course, there's a variety of things that can be done to overcome divisions. And one is kind of quite logical from my talk, because a lot of the cultural perceptions are very difficult to immediately change, right? So if there's a frustration, a sense of opposition towards all elites, government as a whole, the view that we are living in a corona dictatorship, or things like that, very difficult to change because it's so post-factual. It's so driven by social network myths and lies that you can do little. You can really only do little about it. What you can do, and that's what I've tried to show, is that some of the economic policies have failed. That some of these unjust and also unfair and unequal distributions of power and economic resources are quite real. And they do, of course, feed into certain resentments. So you cannot, it's much more difficult to change these lingering resentments, cultural attitudes. So I always say political systems, economic, everything you can change overnight, theoretically. You cannot change political, cultural mentalities, attitudes overnight. That's a long process. It always is. But in order to do that, you actually have to overcome. I mean, 30 years is a long time. We should have done better in overcoming these economic problems and inequalities. We should have done much better as a government to resolving this. When it comes to wages, how can it be that you just simply get lower wages for the same work? Both when it comes to gender divides, but also when it comes, particularly here, when it comes to East-West divides. That doesn't make any sense. So a lot more could be done and could have been done to overcome this. And if this would have been overcome, I'm sure this will not take away all other problems, but it would reduce them. As we see that those who actually have more social mobility, and the younger generations in particular, those divisions matter considerably less. Which is also another answer. My hope, of course, is the future generations.
Thank you, Lars. We have a question from the online audience, and also the next I see already on site. So we start with the online question. I will just read it out. You mentioned that for relations to improve, it was necessary for the Nazi time myths to be debunked. In general, it is easy to see why being honest with ourselves is a good thing, but how did this affect specifically the Dutch-German relations?
Well, first of all, yeah, it's not just a good thing. It's actually, I would argue, a necessary thing. So there's two types of scholarship that said, like, okay, democratization lives on institutions and it's based on institutions. And then once the institutions are robust, we can actually try to have these conversations about truth and democracy. I'm not in that camp, let's put it this way. I do think that actually confronting the past and confronting political cultural legacies, including collaboration and crimes, is actually a necessary element for democratization in the first place, and also makes institutions and trust in institutions much more robust. So it doesn't really work that way, that you basically just put some institutions there and then hope that they will resolve these problems. So I do think it's enormously important for the development of a public trust, of democratization of society, to face and deconstruct and demystify national myths. In the German-Dutch relations, this is crucial. This is key, because many of these perceptions, again, like, lingered on, and they were often based on myths, right? It would have been a very different trajectory in post-war German-Dutch relationships if actually on both sides these myths wouldn't have existed. If we both could have said, well, yeah, the Germans are primary culprits in this. They're really like, Germany started this, and Germany was responsible for these incredible atrocities, unprecedented atrocities in the history of humankind. However, we're not really being a resistance nation here. There's been an enormous amount of collaboration. So we have our share, not on the same plane, but we have our share as Dutch in this process. If this would have happened at a much earlier stage, this would have shifted and transformed German-Dutch relations massively beyond the kind of economic necessities and other things in the post-war decades. I think it would have been a game changer, but it didn't happen. And I mean, there are reasons why it didn't happen. There are reasons why the Germans didn't want to face the truth about their past and the atrocities, and there are reasons why the Dutch didn't want to face it. So, but we can't change history in retrospect, but it is important.
Thank you very much, Lars. I saw a raised hand here in the room. Yes, two, in fact. So I'll just walk over there first, if that's okay. Please.
Okay, my name is Jaap Wienia. Thank you very much for your lecture. You ended with a kind of statement. It seems like the Dutch are closer to the Germans than East Germans are to West Germans, and vice versa. The first image that came into my mind and the first thoughts were before the Einwehrung in 1990. We had discussions during Christmas with family members about how will it be? What will we choose? And we compared Eastern Germany's system, Western Germany's system with countries like Sweden and the Netherlands. And I think we came out to, at that moment, those systems were kind of, when you would see it as a gap with a big ditch, those systems were an island in between, more social and also more liberal, more social than the West and more liberal than the East. So I think maybe we're still lying in between.
I agree with you. Thanks for the comment.
Okay, and we have another question in the room. I hand over the mic to Iwona.
Thank you. My question is about social media. Do you think this contributes to the sort of cementing of this wall, or the factors are different than social media? If it didn't exist, they would be still there.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is related to the fact that there was a huge migration within Germany between the East and the West, especially from the West to the East, from the East to the West, but also vice versa. Did anyone conduct some research surveys on these particular groups regarding, for example, their political behavior, political sympathies of these people who moved from the West to the East and vice versa?
I'll start with that question, the second question, because it's easier to answer. Yes, there's research, and actually, just for a matter of time, I didn't include East-West migration. I actually, in a longer version of this, I'm actually discussing that. There's research on that. Yes, there's massive migration, actually migration in both directions. There's also now back migration, which is great, because initially in the 1990s, 2000s, it was really Easterners, young generations leaving. And now, for example, because universities in the East offer a better student per professor ratio, so they're really like trying to get students back to East Germany. We see a kind of back migration now, which is a very promising sign, because you do want to have this, like, more equal. There is still net migration overall to the West. In terms of attitude, how this translates, it translates massively to overcoming the divide. So people who have been moving back and forth are exactly to a large extent among these younger generations, and for whom this divide matters much less, considerably much less, than to someone who lived in Saxony, for example, all his or her life. So we really see this as a massive difference. And basically we see it also with the most successful European Union's program, that is the Erasmus program. People who actually move around have a much more Europe. You can make surveys with these students, and they have a much more pro-European attitude than the average European. So there is a massive impact of experience and exchange. That is demonstrable. On the social media question, Yeah. They're much less likely to vote AfD for that matter. Yeah. On the social media question, yes, social media, of course, this is deceptive name. Maybe we should call it better social networks. I'm also using social media because they're not media. They are kind of they're networks that pretend to be a media or these platforms, but they're actually agents. So what happens there is political communications and agents of political communication. And of course, there's a lot of research now evolving on the ratio of between populism and social media, and some contestations about the media bubbles and how far they matter, the extent to which they matter. But I'm also in that camp of the scholarship that believes that actually they do matter. They do matters that people are using in an illiterate way. Media literacy is very important. These different sources cannot distinguish between valid and invalid sources. There's a massive distrust against established or so-called mainstream media, and populist agents actually also using this particularly strongly. So you see much more populist activism on social media, social networks than from mainstream parties. And that's also a finding that goes beyond just the German or the East German case. So yes, it does play a role to reinforcing. Without social media, wouldn't there be any political divide? No, because we had these political divides before social media. Are they reinforced while there are other trends that are actually pointing towards the closure of the divide in terms of intergenerational change, value change? Yes, it's actually reinforcing something. These agents are actually reinforcing divisions that, when you looked at intergenerational cohorts and developments, would possibly be much smaller than there would be without it.
Thank you so much, Lars, once more for this wonderful talk, and thanks to everyone for joining the discussion. We are on a tight time schedule, so I would kindly hand over now to the second keynote speaker of today. Thank you once more so much, Lars. This was really fantastic and a great kickoff for our keynote section. So now it is my great pleasure and here's your well-earned applause once more. There must be time for this, surely. Now I have the honor to introduce our second keynote speaker for today, Professor Jacco Pekelder, who was recently appointed full professor for modern Dutch history and director of the Center for Netherlands Studies at the University of Münster. So we have kind of the cross movement from what you addressed earlier, dear Lars. So we have a Dutchman now working at the University of Münster here, which was a brilliant move in terms of casting for this event here today, of course. Dear Jacco, thank you so much for joining us today. Jacco will be joining online and talking online about the rise of Germany in the 19th century and its development after the 1990 unification from a Dutch and European perspective. I hand over to you, dear Jacco. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Florian. I hope everybody can hear me well. If not, please intervene this time. And I have a PowerPoint, but the organization will operate that for me because there was a slight mishap in dealing with it, handling it from my Münster workplace. So thanks very much also to the organizers for having me, and I'm very happy to be here. I can at this time not see the PowerPoint, but I'd like to go to the second slide now, if that's okay with you. Yeah, great. So today we are looking back to Germany's unification in 1990. 31 years ago, there was a momentous occasion, a central event and accelerator of the conclusion of the Cold War and pars pro toto of the disappearance of the East-West divide that had characterized European politics for more than 4 decades. Overall, European citizens reacted with sympathy and delight to the events in Germany. Everyone could relate to the newsreels of Berliners celebrating the madness of the fall of the wall on the 9th of November 1989. For a few instances all around the world, Wahnsinn was one of the best known German words. And hardly anyone shed a tear when 11 months later, the German Democratic Republic vanished completely and the newly founded Eastern states became part of the Federal Republic of Germany. Which is not to say, and Lars already referred to those, that there were no political concerns about the emergence of a strong and unified Germany in the center of our continent. For some intellectuals, for instance, warnings of a Fourth Reich were at hand. And we all know that leading politicians such as François Mitterrand, Margaret Thatcher, and our own Ruud Lubbers cherished and sometimes expressed their reservations about an enlarged German nation state in the middle of Europe. In essence, however, their doubts were overcome swiftly and easily by a combination of American pressure and Chancellor Helmut Kohl's strong commitment to European integration and NATO. Instead of going it alone, the new Germany would dive ever deeper into the pooled sovereignty that we know as the European Union. Developments since then have brought us so far that in recent times, calls for greater German leadership in Europe can hardly be overheard. Especially during the financial and economic crisis around 2010, and also during the moral depression that befell the West after Trump took up residency in the White House, many turned to Germany and its somewhat taciturn but evidently decent leader, Angela Merkel, for guidance and solutions. As a result, over the last 7 or 8 years, foreign policy experts have diagnosed the emergence of a new German question, like Timothy Garton-Ash, for instance, called it, and a new German hegemony of some sort, albeit, as Hans Kunani has called it, a geo-economic semi-hegemony or the dominance of a vulnerable hegemon, as famous political scientist Herfried Münkler has captioned it. Attention in these debates is often centered on Germany itself. We're pleased by leading centrist politicians for their country to take greater responsibility in world politics, mostly fail to convince most Germans who still seem to prefer Germany and Europe to position themselves on the world stage as outsized Switzerlands. In contrast, there's little reflection on the remarkable fact that Germany's neighbors, or at least many of them, nowadays at times yearn and call for leadership of Germany. This is unfortunate because there is a lot of uncertainty surrounding the attitudes of these neighbors, and it certainly merits more investigation to inquire about the nature of these calls for German leadership and the nature of these fortunate views of Germany nowadays. I surmise that these foreigners will probably lose their appetite for German leadership quite swiftly when Berlin starts to take them up on their word and really tries to lead the continent. A lot of history points in that direction. Over time, Germany's neighbors, more often than not, have been very uneasy with German power. When I go by the literature, reasons for this include, for one, Germany's critical location in Europe's center, combined with its relative size in terms of population, economy, and cultural capacities. Secondly, uncertainty about Germany's identity versus the identity of its neighbors, including uneasiness about its borders. And three, of course, dark experiences with Germany in the past, especially both world wars, that makes neighbors wary of its internal political constitution. Next slide, please. This complex of reasons is often called the German question, which some historians and political scientists consider the central problem of European history since the Middle Ages. For instance, the famous German expert Wolf de Grüner, living in Hamburg nowadays. In my mind, it would help us better understand the current situation and therefore the future of Europe if we would take the large body of literature on the German question seriously and develop a longue durée, a long-term reading of Germany's relations with its European surroundings. Over the last years, with the current debate about German leadership in mind, I have therefore begun to take another look at the gradual emergence of the idea of German unity and its complex realization between 1830 and 1871. And I've specifically asked myself how Germany's neighbors at the time reacted to this process that then still was very much open-ended. To narrow this research down somewhat and amplify specific aspects of Germany's relationships with its neighbors, I have selected three pairs. First, Britain and France, two great powers confronted with the emergence of a new competitor. This highlights the systemic aspect of the German question. In other words, its impact on the European state system then and now. The second pair is Poland and Italy, two neighboring nations that, like the Germans around the middle of the 19th century, aspire to create a nation state. This point stresses the recurrent theme of cooperating versus competing nationalisms in European history. And the third pair is a familiar one for Dutch, so Denmark and the Netherlands, two small monarchies that directly neighbor Germany, whose kings in the 19th century ruled small German principalities, which made them members of the German Confederation and made their countries involuntary parties to the drive to German unity, which sheds light on the persistent problem of Germany's asymmetrical relations with many of its neighbors. Most neighbors are smaller, clearly smaller than Germany is, and this also creates a specific tension and precariousness of their relations. Sorry for this. Oh, terrible. Sorry for this distraction. I'm sorry. My phone is out, but it takes over my computer anyhow. There was a clear cut, by the way, so it's not so much of a problem. I question the reactions of these six neighbors to the process of German unification on three levels. First, security. How did conceptions of European security play a part in the reactions What kind of schemes did they come up with? Self-image, how did these perceptions relate to debates within the neighboring nations about their own national identities? And the third point, transfer. And what do practices of cooperation, transfer, and exchange between Germans and their neighbors tell us about the above, about the security issues and about the self-image issues? Let's first now go to the European security issues, and that's the fourth slide, please. Yes, great. So my research so far has already been quite rewarding on all three levels and for all 6 countries. But with regard to security, it is interesting to note that from the 1830s onwards, and sometimes even earlier, a number of sometimes powerful political leaders and political minds who championed liberal and nationalist agendas also produced elaborate schemes for new European security structures that were also meant to take care of the German question. So the first example is a very early one and involves the Polish prince you see to the left, Adam Czartoryski. For more than 70 years, he acted in Europe's highest circles as an aristocratic, highly cultured diplomatic representative of the cause of Polish freedom. A friend of young Tsar Alexander, for a short spell he even was Russia's acting foreign minister. Just before that time, in 1803, he drew an intricate plan for a new political system to be executed by Russia at its title when. At a time when Napoleon laid the axe to the Holy Roman Empire, Czartoryski designed a new map of Central Europe, a German national empire independent of both Austria and Prussia and organized as a federation or confederation. He even advised Alexander to hastily arouse slumbering German national awareness before Prussia would usurp the cause of German national unity. These ideas about Germany and Czartoryski's scheme were merely part of a master plan for a fundamental makeover of Europe on the basis of an enhanced national homogeneity and more natural borders. In a way, it was an early nationalist response to predecessors like the Duke of Sully and Abbé de Saint-Pierre and their schemes for a European Republic of perpetual peace. Throughout his career, Czartoryski continued to update and defend his master plan, first in diplomatic circles and after the Polish Rising of 1830-31, when his ties to Russia finally erupted, also in public. There in the public sphere, Czartoryski's scheme connected to other plans for a united Europe of free nations. Just like our Polish prince, the Italian revolutionary and patriot Giuseppe Mazzini, in the middle, active in European politics from the 1830s, claimed that nationalism and European solidarity between nations could go together well. In his mind, cooperation between European patriots was essential, not only to liberate their nations, but also to deal with unavoidable international conflicts of interest. Mazzini was more of a realist than we sometimes think. He thus considered German nationalism an ally, and he even called upon the Germans to fulfill their mission to civilize the North, just like the Italians were civilizing Southern Europe in his eyes. Thirdly, Louis Napoleon, the later French Emperor Napoleon III, to a degree, thought along the same lines. In his younger years, he had fought alongside Italian patriots against Austrian and papal rule. He had even lost his elder brother to that cause. In the 1850s and 1860s, as Emperor of the French, Napoleon III championed a restructuring of Europe on the basis of nationalities. And although it's notoriously difficult for historians to get a grip on his motives, it seems he was favorably disposed towards the struggle for German national unity. In contrast to many of his countrymen, he was not really interested in French gains on the left bank of the Rhine. Instead, he envisaged a European confederation of national conglomerates as an outcome of a European conference that would convene under his presidency and replace the Vienna state system of Metternich. At the crucial moment, though, when Prussia beat Austria in 1866, France stood isolated, and after that, to take a big shortcut, the country let frustration get the upper hand in her foreign and German policies, with the War of 1870 and 71 as the bitter result. Let's now go to the second point about Germany's neighbor self-image on the 5th slide, please. What I also found next to this thinking about European security is that the process of German unification also impacted upon the formation of national identities of other European nations. This counted for both great power neighbors, Britain and France, where politicians and publicists began to reflect more about what set their countries apart from Germany, and it counted all the more for Germany's smaller neighbors. In Denmark, for instance, this was forced upon the country by 2 wars with Germany about Schleswig and Holstein, wars that Danish liberals in their fight for a unitary constitutional monarchy must also take some responsibility for. When the Netherlands were confronted by the process of German unification, this country was struggling very much to find a new sense of purpose after having lost Belgium in the 1830s. This led to a degree of distancing oneself from things considered typically German to emerge as a constituent element of imagined national identity of the Netherlands. Hints of this already can be discerned around 1848, but a breakthrough seems to have come in the 1860s, especially after the German-German War and the Prussian annexation of Hanover. Isn't the independence existence of Hanover founded on the same treaties that uphold their own independence? Prince Henry, a brother of King William III of the Netherlands, exclaimed at the time. Dutch politicians and publicists raised the anxious question how Prussia was to be stopped. Some placed their bets on a modernization of the territorial army, and in 1871, a new cabinet indeed presented itself, arm-shouldered, as the Prime Minister said. Realizing that in military matters, a Prusso-German threat could never be effectively neutralized by a small country like the Netherlands, however, a host of mostly liberal writers brought Dutch national identity into play as the best bulwark against Prussia or Germany. In 1871, for instance, a writer in a liberal Protestant magazine called upon his fellow citizens to be proud of their own language and cultivate it. In his eyes, that would be a better way to stimulate our own nationality than to pull some small Krupp cannon to our borders for show. The basic asset of Dutch identity was the love of freedom these publicists maintained. This was what distinguished the Dutch from the authoritarian-ruled Germans. At the same time, Bismarck's policies, including his monumental fight against the Prussian liberals, were also appropriated by Dutch authors to serve as warnings against illiberal tendencies at home. Let me skip a bit and go to the 6th slide and the 3rd point, transfer, exchange, and cooperation. Finally, there's an unexpected element of transfer, exchange, and cooperation in the story of Germany's neighbors and the German unification. It is important to keep this in mind because it relativizes the role of nations and nation states. As already hinted at while mentioning Mazzini, nationalists, be they Polish, Italian, German, or even French, often saw each other more as allies than as rivals. Especially up until 1848, there was much cooperation and transfer of ideas between groups like Young Italy, Young Poland, and Young Germany. There even was an organization called Young Europe at the time. This sometimes even included joint attempts at armed insurrection, such as the 1833 storming of the Frankfurt guardhouses and the concurrent failed crossing of Germany's southwestern border by armed Polish legionaries from French Besançon. Most intriguing is probably the enormous wave of solidarity in Germany after the Polish Rising of November 1830. Especially impressive was the Cultuur that met the 10,000 Polish officers traveling in 1831 to 1832 from Germany's eastern border to exile in France after the Russian army had beaten them. In every town along the prescribed routes, cheering crowds, festive dinners, and lavish drinking parties awaited them. And of course, there were also celebrations of Polish and German nationalist revolutions at the so-called Hambach Festival in 1832, pictured here in this beautiful image with Polish and German flags going to the top of Hambach mountain. Polish leaders tried to make instrumental use of this German sympathy by morally pressing on them to not only talk about their love of Poland, but also really act upon it. The 1848 Springtime of Nations, however, revealed large fissures between Polish and German nationalists about the future of Poznania, then a Prussian territory. In the province itself, the Polish side proved unwilling to allow Germans or Jews to join the so-called National Committee. This made it easier for Prussian conservatives to stir up inter-ethnic conflict and obstruct designs of Polish autonomy. Final slide, please. So let me finish by stating what these limited but meaningful examples tell us about the neighborly reactions to Germany's rise in the 19th century and how they help to understand the dynamic surrounding the German question then and now. First, we have to appreciate that the various politicians and publicists of these nations, these neighboring nations, had their own political ideas and agendas that framed how they weighed and judged what happened in Germany. That's why Poles, Italians, and even a Frenchman like Louis Napoleon were initially willing to cooperate with the German national movement. Or another unmentioned example, we cannot understand British attitudes towards German unification if we fail to take into account how much British hopes of eventual political liberalization of Prussia on account of its economic modernization and the Zollverein gradually led to a melting away of objections to a Prussian-led German union. These kinds of framing effects are probably effective today as well. Second, it is interesting to note that when people have thought about European stability and peace, they mostly have included thoughts about Europe's center, Germany, even well before 1871, when finally it adapted more or less to the model of a nation state. In fact, the solution of the German question by embedding Germany in a European confederation of some sort or other is far older than the post-war idea of European integration. Acknowledging this prehistory might add to the legitimacy of the European Union. And third and last point, seeing from our vantage point in the 21st century how these 19th century people reacted to a Germany gaining in political clout helps us relativize negative reactions and obstructive actions on the side of Germany's neighbors nowadays. Because, and that's my final point, it turns our gaze to more positive examples of transfer, exchange, and cooperation as well. On optimistic days, I even think it might assist us in finding more sensible ways to deal with them than our predecessors did. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, dear Jacco, for this very detailed and fascinating insights. I'm sure there will be questions, and luckily we have a few minutes left for these. I hope you heard the well-earned applause here on site. So who wants to go first? Online participants, as previously, please simply go to the lower right corner of your screen, click on the speech bubble and type your question there. On-siters can simply raise their hand. Who wants to go first? So we have time for 2 questions, I would think, looking at my clock and remembering the tight time schedule. So here's your chance, everybody. I'm happy to take the first question slot then. Dear Jacco, you mentioned the term or the concept of a national identity several times. And if I'm not mistaken, usually in the context of, well, strategy, broadly speaking, right? So activating the idea or the ideal of a national identity with particular political purposes. This is, of course, a topic that is also very pertinent in contemporary discussions still, even though it also has a competitor, I would think, namely the European cultural identity or European identity question. So I was wondering how you would relate your observations as to historical, 19th century, clearly the whole concept, nation state and national identity as well is of course hard to compare to an extent, but I was really struck by this repeated use, or as I said, strategical use of this term rather than a kind of an affirmative identification from the political side. If I'm not mistaken, then please correct me there. How you would relate this use of this kind of strategical aspect to contemporary discourses on national and also European identity in our context here, for instance.
Yeah, for one, I see it more like you have multiple identities. Every citizen of basically every individual in the world has multiple identities, some related to politics, so that would be, for instance, and of course a kind of culture, and that is in part a European identity. It's in part probably also a national identity, although not everybody might, let's say, embrace the identity that his or her passport brings with it. What is fascinating in the 19th century is that nationalism was very much identified with liberalism and with the fight for more participation, maybe even democracy. Of course, in the 19th century, liberalism is not to be equated with democracy immediately, but there's some distance there. But of course, there were radical liberals that called for full democracy already then. And if somebody like Mazzini talks about nationalism, he immediately takes into account that we also talk about at least future democracy, and not only on a national scale, but also on a European scale at least, and maybe even on a global scale. So there's less friction there in the 19th century, at least, than we would now, with the lessons of the 20th century in mind, would of course take with us. And I think it's good to historicize that a bit, and maybe also look back on history a bit, why it should not have to be an antagonist relation between European identity and European politics and national identity, national politics. It might also strengthen each other, or even help us to build on top of each other, instead of instead of also maybe leaving the field to those people that embrace national politics with a singular focus. So that's basically my first response, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jacco. And here we have an online question, so I hand over to Stein for this.
Yes, I'm just going to read out the question. You pointed out some times in which Dutch identity was formed as a response to German events. What role did the Duchy of Limburg, as a part of both the Netherlands and the German Confederation between 1839 and 1866, play in the wish for a Dutch identity?
Exactly, yeah. So it's very complicated. So I won't even go into explaining why Limburg was a part, but it was indeed a part of the German Confederation. The Dutch king, a bit of fictitious, as Duke of Limburg, was a member of this league of princes and free cities that was the German Confederation. And in 1848 and again in 1859, this almost led to a conflict with Germany, because the Netherlands got entangled in first in the German Revolution of 1848, when the Limburgers wanted to join this new German state, and in 1859 they were threatened by the prospect of being forced to enter the war in Italy on the Austrian side, because the Germans considered joining the Austrians against the French and the Piedmontese. This strengthened to a degree the resolve of the Dutch government to get out of that bind in some way or other. The problem, however, and this is the asymmetrical side of the relationship with Germany, the problem, however, was that at times when there was international peace and stability and quiet, no Dutch government dared to raise the issue because they were afraid to get all the attention of Germany directed to them and maybe get into problems with Germany. Because they didn't want to give up Limburg, so the price would have to be paid by the Germans, of course. And at times of great international crises, even war, for instance, during the Crimean War or in the 1860s, when this Bismarck-Pyrenean Wars raged over the continent, they didn't dare to do it because there was so much fury and anger and destruction going around that you don't want the Netherlands to be part of that. So they were basically in a very tight spot and didn't try to didn't do anything out of fear. What my point is that because the Netherlands was from the late 1830s until about the 1860s in a process of reevaluating their own identity, and the Germans were on the rise. The idea that maybe the Netherlands would simply merge with Germany and vanish into a big Germany was sometimes raised in the Netherlands, and of course also raised in uncertainty about the future of something like an independent Dutch monarchy. And then that gives me the idea that then far earlier than we sometimes think about, because mostly the idea is that only after the Second World War, anti-German feelings become a constituent part of Dutch identity. I think already in the 1860s, these become part of Dutch national identity as a kind of a significant other function that the Germans then acquire. Involuntary, of course, but from the Dutch point of view.
Thank you so very much, dear Jacco, and thank you everyone for listening and joining the discussion online as well. As I mentioned the time schedule already, I'm afraid we have to close this discussion on the second keynote at this point. All the best over there, Jacco. Hopefully see you both soon again in person. Take good care.
Exactly.
Thank you once more.
Yeah,
this
thanks.
is your final applause here in the room for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, we have 15 minutes break. We're just like 5 minutes behind, so I would suggest, or 7, I would suggest we reconvene at 3:25. So let's take the 15 minutes and then continue with the first panel discussion for today. All right, welcome back, everyone. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to my dear colleague Rachel Retzer, who is a lecturer here at the University of Groningen, also in European culture and literature. And she will moderate the first citizen panel and also briefly elaborate on what the citizen panel is all about. That is, I assume that everyone knows this already. So here, citizens, both of the Netherlands as well as of Germany, elaborate on their individual experiences, memories, and perspectives on German reunification. So I gladly hand over to you, dear Rachel. Please take over.
Thank you, Florian. So as Florian pointed out, this is our first citizen panel. And before we get started, I will introduce to you our guests. On my left, we have our first guest, Minke Faber. Minke has lived in Hamburg, West Germany, with her German husband from 1982 to 1988. And between 2013 and 2017, she studied here at the University of Groningen for her bachelor's and master's diploma in European languages and cultures, where she also specialized in German. Next to Minke is our second guest for today, Petra Nieuwenhuizen. Petra was part of 2 student exchanges between the cities of Groningen and Magdeburg in the former GDR, organized by a Christian student association. During these exchanges, she met her German husband. They now both live together in Groningen. Welcome to both of you. For my 2 guests on my right, we have Maria Ufkes-Kayat. Maria grew up as the daughter of a reverend in Mecklenburg, part of the former GDR. She has lived in Potsdam and Berlin and has been living in Groningen for the past 30 years now. Welcome, Maria. And our 4th guest of this panel is Jaap Wienja. Jaap, like Petra Nieuwenhuisden, has also visited the GDR as part of an exchange. In his case, exchange between his church community in the village of Eelde-Paterswolde in the province of Groningen and the city of Güstrow in the former GDR. During this exchange, he has met his wife, and they married 1 year before the fall of the Berlin Wall. I will now move to the back as we get started with the discussion. Now, first to all 4 of you, thank you very much for joining us today. We are very happy that you want to share your stories and your statements with us. All 4 of you have known both the divided and the reunited Germany. You have experienced the time before and after the fall of the wall. And in this discussion, we would love to hear from you how you experienced this and how you look back on it, and maybe how your perspective on Germany may have changed if you compare the before and the after. Minke, would you like to start and share your thoughts with us?
Yes, well, in 1982, I went to Germany, and I lived with my friend and later husband there. Before I went to Germany, at that time, there was the Cold War was going on, and there were a lot of tensions and demonstrations with the nuclear weapons, so neutron bombs and so on. First of all, I want to apologize for my English. It might not be so perfect as the other speakers were, but I hope you will understand everything. And as I came to Hamburg, I realized that also in Germany they demonstrated, and there were worries about the Soviet Union, but also the focus was more lying on the separate German, so on the East German and the West German, instead of the fear from the East Bloc. So in the Netherlands, where everything behind the Iron Curtain was the East Bloc, and that was the tension. And in West Germany, they had more focus, of course, logically, for the separation. There were people living in East Germany, which were relatives of my mother-in-law, for instance, or of colleagues, and we sent packages to them. They often wrote us letters. Could you please send us some things? And we sent packages with stockings and oranges and coffee and so on. And well, of course, we were confronted there with the border. So when you came close to the border, there were always towers with soldiers on them and with rifles and standing there. Even at Travemünde, for instance, we were swimming there, and 100 meters on the right there was the tower of the GDR, and there was a soldier standing in the heat with his uniform all day with his rifle, now and then pointing a bit with his rifle to us. And when we were swimming in the sea, we were kind of scared for that. So it was not really relaxing. And of course, I visited Berlin once, and we had to go to Helmstedt, to the border. There we were standing 3 hours at the border because we were suspect. I lent a car from relatives, and my husband was German and I was Dutch, and they were very suspected. And we had to get out of the car, and our luggage had to get out of the car. And there was a man standing and pointing at me with his Kalashnikov. But finally, after 3 hours, we could drive to Berlin, and we drove on this Transitstrecke was the name. That's one road where we were allowed to drive, and we were not allowed to stop. And I remember all those rundown buildings on the side of the road. There were Russian barracks there, and all was gray and neglected and old. And further on, we saw villages, and all was very old and neglected, and that impressed me very much. And of course, Berlin itself was also rather depressive, to see the wall and the crosses on the wall where the people were shot who fled from east to west. And well, okay, and in 1984, at the work of my husband, there came a man who fled from East Germany, and he came to work there, and his name was Andreas, but because there were already 3 people who were called Andreas on the company of my husband, they called him Tony. And Tony was rather, it sounds really discriminated, but Tony was rather proud of his name, but he managed to flee into West Germany. He fled in the middle of the night with his wife and child through the woods, through Czechia, and then from Austria he came to Hamburg, to the north, and he told about that. And okay, he felt very free there and welcome. But on the other side, he missed also the living in the GDR. And the first months, he didn't have contact with his family. He was very afraid something would happen to his family and to his relatives or friends. He didn't tell them anything. But after some time, about 5 months, he started to write, and it was okay. And then the people wrote back and they asked money, and he was not exaggerating, but those people really thought he was in paradise and he was a millionaire, and they asked for money and luxurious things. And said he was very frustrated about that, because okay, the wages were very different, but he also had to pay much more. And he said in the GDR they didn't have to pay for health insurances, for instance, or something like that, and now he had to pay everything. So he couldn't send this money, what people thought, and in their heads it was as if he was very, very rich, but of course he was normal wages here. So well, in 1988 we went back to Holland, and we didn't have contact with him anymore. And in 1989 the wall fell. I was watching television, and we were very, very surprised, and it was so special. And in the first hours we thought, oh, this is going wrong, there is going to be a shooting, it can't be real. But then we realized it's okay. And in the first days we already thought, well, maybe the border is going to close again. So we couldn't believe it that it was over, this. But actually finally, of course, the unification came, and yeah, okay, after that we lived in Holland, and we heard a lot of that. There were writers writing about this time, and we experienced a lot of things we didn't know. So the Stasi was known, but not in details as we knew then after the reunification. And well, I haven't been in East Germany all those years, and at the beginning of this year, suddenly my youngest son said, well, I'm going to do a master's study in Leipzig. Are you coming with me? Because I'm searching an apartment. And then I drove to East Germany, and I realized I drove then, oh, I'm in East Germany. And I was driving, and suddenly I thought, this is crazy thought, because it was so in the head. So this is East Germany, and when we arrived in Leipzig, I saw a lot of renovations, new buildings, but also a part of old buildings, with these old German blocks, which were very rundown blocks. And also I noticed that the rents were very low, and the wages were also very low. And yeah, I think the reunification is what the other speaker also said. On the one hand, it's successful, but on the other hand, I think in the heads of people of my age, I think that there is still a strong division between East and West. That a long time it was Aussies and Westies, but and now it's fades away a bit. But I think the next generation will have it less, and I think within 50 years, when we are not there anymore, and the next generation is older, I think then our grandchildren there will be some differences. I think this economical difference is very large, but I don't think this is the real difference. And I don't think I think the division is more in the heads of the people in East and West Germany as well. No? So, and then I agree with the former speaker who told this as well. So and you could see that. I think we have to take the time, and after 50 or 70 years, it might be quite different. So.
Thank you very much, Minke, for sharing your statement and your stories. Petra, like Minke, you have also are Dutch yourself, but your partner is German and from the former GDR. Could you tell us your story and how you look on this topic and your perspective on Germany over time?
Yes, I visited the GDR in 1989 with a group of students from Groningen. We visited Magdeburg, and we visited it twice, in March and in October. And the first thing you notice from the GDR is the border, and that's still pretty intimidating when you think of it. We came there very late, it was dark, but you have very bright lights. Your passport is taken away, it's on a conveyor belt, and you don't see it back. You see it disappearing, and you hope it will get back. And they came into the bus with all the passports, and they look if everyone in the passport is also there in the bus, and not someone extra or something, or someone less. And I saw trucks coming out of GDR going to West Germany, and there were soldiers around them with dogs, and they were looking beneath them if there were people. And well, that's all pretty intimidating if you see that. I've never seen that before. And the whole weekend I had the feeling that I was going back in time. Everything, all the furniture, the rooms, the offices, the shops, the clothes people had, you go 10 years back in time or something. And it was, yeah, very interesting actually. But also very strange was that you see soldiers on the street, Russian soldiers. I had never seen that. They were in the bus with us, and it's very strange. But the students were actually very nice. They talk, of course, German. They had a different background, but if you talk to them and play games and you cook together and you walk, and then not actually different than us. So that was very nice. And the second time was in October. And in the meantime, a lot had happened already. You had these people that went to the embassy in Prague and who went in West Germany. You had all the demonstrations going on. Me and my husband, we had already phoned sometimes during all these months, and he had one phone for the whole flat he was living in. It was a student's flat. He had one room, a small room, he shared with two other people. There were 3 beds, one table and one cupboard. That was all they had. And they had also in the hall, there was one phone, and sometimes it was just, it just stopped. And we didn't know, is the connection bad, or does the Stasi just cut off our conversation? I sent him a card from England where I had my holiday, and it never reached him. He had never got it. And but in October, the situation was different. We talked also a lot about it. But when we left, you had the feeling, I'm never going to see these people again. We had no idea that the wall was going to open. So that was really sad actually. And then suddenly the 9th of November came, and I remember that I put my television on. I had a small television in my room, and everything was going on there. And I looked the whole evening. I remember that, and I was so excited. It's also because you know people there, and you are more involved with everything. I had followed it all these weeks, what was happening there. And I had to speak to someone, so I called my mother very late. And I said, Mom, did you see it? Have you the television on? And yeah, I remember that still. After that, they could, for the first time, they could come to the Netherlands. They visited Groningen. It was in the Christmas holiday. And pretty soon after that, my husband and I got a relationship. And I visited through the years very many times Germany. We see German television every day, and we looked at a lot of documentaries and films. You have about Second World War, Cold War, Fall of the Mauer, Fall of the Wall, and you see that they do that pretty good in Germany. I think they show it from all kinds of angles, and I learned a lot. In the beginning, I only thought, how can people be negative? It's beautiful when the walls open and you can speak freely. You don't have to be afraid. But I also see that it must have been difficult for people because so many things changed in a short time. Especially when you have worked for a long time, when you are older, and certainly your factory is closed, and you have to find a new job, and you don't know how do you do that in a new society, and your education may not be enough. You have to look for an all new profession. The things you can buy, you always bought in the shop, you can't find them anymore, and I can think that all makes you negative. You know, new political parties, you don't know and what do they stand for, and you have sometimes the feeling that was it all worthless? What we had, what we did, who we are, and I can understand that it makes you negative, but at the same time, if you think at the Stasi, think of the Stasi, then it was when you had a small problem, you said one thing wrong, then it could be huge. And I visited 2 years ago the prison in Berlin, Hohenschönhausen, from the Stasi, and we were guided there by a man who had been a prisoner there, and he told us so many things, how they were treated and what the idea behind that treatment was, that when I left, I thought, I knew it was bad, but it was so bad, it was even worse as I thought. And then I think, well, it's only good that the wall fell down. That was my story.
Thank you very much, Petra, for your story, and now also for showing the different perspectives on this. You know, some people might say, oh, 30 years, that's such a long time. It's really not. It's quite a short time, and everything that happened is still very much alive in the minds of people who have actually been there. For our next statement is by Maria Ufkes. You will be delivering your statement in German, and I will be translating to English for the audience. Before we start, could you maybe hand me the clicker, because you also wanted to show some images? Yes, could you hand it to me? Thank you.
Mein Statement beschreibe ich ganz kurz: beheimatet, betrogen und belogen. Das klingt sehr negativ, aber ich will die Vergangenheit beleuchten. 30 Jahre, die Hälfte meines Lebens habe ich in der DDR gewohnt mit Zweckoptimismus. Die Schule war keine Herausforderung, es war langweilig. Ich lernte vor allen Dingen die Topografie der Sowjetunion, Schulfächer wie Einführung in die sozialistische Produktion. Die ersetzten den Unterricht in zum Beispiel europäische Literatur. ESP, Einführung in die sozialistische Produktion, bedeutete auf dem Feld arbeiten oder im Stall. wir sangen Lieder, Brüder zur Sonne, zur Freiheit. Wir sangen, ich trage eine Fahne und diese Fahne ist rot. Wir sangen, wir sind jung, die Welt ist offen. Mein Vater durfte nicht zur Beerdigung seiner Mutter fahren, die in Westdeutschland lebte. Ich habe viel verpasst, es war mein Gefühl danach. Viel verpasst. Es war viel verboten, aber ich habe nichts vergessen.
So what Maria is basically telling us is the Jira was my home, and I have been lied to and cheated a lot from my perspective. I have lived there for 30 years with a necessary optimism. School was very easy for me and very boring, in fact. We learned quite a lot about the topography of the Soviet Union, but I knew a lot about that. We had classes like an introduction to socialist production, which in practice was child labor on the field. Those were our classes instead of European literature. We sang songs like Brother to the Sun, to Freedom. I'm carrying a flag and this flag is red. These songs are still very much in my mind. They also taught us we are young and the world is open, but at the same time, my father was not allowed to visit his mother, like to bury his mother, in the western part of Germany. I have missed a lot, and a lot was forbidden, and I have not forgotten it.
Ja, Überleben in der Nische. Das heißt, ich war kein Jungpionier, ich war kein FDJler und ich durfte also auch nicht die Schulreisen miterleben. Der Preis war also hoch, ausgeschlossen von all diesen Veranstaltungen. Wie baut man dann in der Pubertät Freundschaften auf? Was liegt hinter dem grauen Gebiet auf der Landkarte? Das ist eine originelle Ostberlin-Landkarte. Was liegt im grauen Gebiet? Reiseerleichterungen gab es dann. Ich durfte 1988 meinen alten Onkel besuchen, offiziell. Ich fuhr natürlich heimlich nach Groningen. Ich kenne meinen Mann seit 1986. In Berlin-Friedrichstraße kommen mir die Tränen und die kommen mir noch, wenn ich das erzähle, weil die Wut in mir stieg. Am Grenzübergang an der westdeutschen Seite hörte ich alle Geräusche aus Ostberlin und ich dachte, das ist ja so dicht bei. Wir wohnen ja so dicht beieinander. Man kann sich ja hören. In Berlin, ein anderes Beispiel, in Berlin hat sich eine Jugendgruppe angemeldet. Wir stehen da und wollen sie erwarten. Einer hat eine Gitarre bei sich. Sie durften nicht über die Grenze mit ihrem Tagesvisum.
I mainly had to survive in a niche because I was not a member of groups like the Young Pioneers or the Free German Youth, which were very big organizations. And because I was not a member, I got excluded from many social activities, such as travels, trips. How do you make friends when that is your childhood and your youth, when you were excluded from so many things? When the travel restrictions were somewhat eased, I was allowed to visit an uncle in the western part of Germany. I secretly traveled to Groningen, a lot further, because I met my husband in 1986. When I was in the western part of Berlin, I cried, and I could still cry about it because I was outraged to learn that if you're on the west side, you could hear what is going on the other side of that wall. We are so close together, and still this wall divides us. Another story I can remember is that there was a group of people who were coming to visit us, and one of them had a guitar, and he was not allowed to enter.
Ja, betrogen, reisen ins Bruderland, in die Sowjetunion, aber nur als Gruppe. Mit vielen extra Kontrollen. Bin ich dann eine Kriminelle im Bruderland? Das Hotel dürfen wir nicht allein verlassen. Ich bringe Freunden heimlich Mangelware. Kaffee, Hautcreme, Feinstrumpfhosen. Es war ein Abenteuer, das hätte mit dem direkten Reiseverbot in das Freundesland bestraft werden können. Ich bin 21 Jahre, fliege nach Alma-Ata, Taschkent. Statt Louvre besuche ich die Eremitage in Leningrad. In Moskau werde ich brutal kontrolliert und eingesperrt, als ich Bettler fotografiere. War das der blühende Kommunismus Anfang der 80er Jahre?
We were allowed to travel to the brother country of the Soviet Union, but only as a group. And there were so many controls during this travel. We were not allowed to leave the hotel by ourselves. Were we criminals? I secretly sent people packages with goods that were lacking, such as coffee, skin cream, pantyhose. I was 21 and I was flying to cities like Alma-Ata and Tashkent. Instead of visiting the Louvre in Paris, I was visiting the Hermitage in Moscow. Sorry? Of course, in Leningrad. You said Moscow earlier. So there were so many controls, and I had many different experiences than people now. And in Moscow, I was arrested and locked up because I photographed the poor people on the streets.
Verbotene Bücher. Christa Wolf. Der Störfall wird im Westen publiziert und in der DDR totgeschwiegen. Stadt der Engel, es geht noch um die Stasi-Vergangenheit von Christa Wolf. So auch 5 Tage im Juni von Stefan Heim. Wir hören heimlich den Radiosender Rias. Ich vermisse die Popmusik und spontane Feste. Solzhenitsyn schmuggeln wir über Westleute unter den Kleidern, wie das schon erzählt wurde. Gerhard Schöne singt in Kirchen Umweltlieder. In Kirchen. Wir kopierten die auf Kassettenbänder. Die habe ich heute noch. Ja, ich bin dabei, als die Mauer fällt. Ich wohne in Berlin, in der Dunkelstraße. Das kann man auch nachlesen im Stern, 111. Ich wohne in Berlin und mit Abscheu sehe ich die doppelte Mauer in Berlin. Mir könnten noch die Tränen kommen. Wir waren doppelt und dreimal doppelt eingemauert. In Potsdam-Babelsberg sogar 5-fach. Ich hatte 2 Wohnungen. Die kosteten 25 Mark. Da konnte man sich 2 Wohnungen leisten. Im Juni 1990 entrinne ich dem Sturm der Währungsreform. In Schweden besuche ich eine Deutschlehrerin. Verdammt nochmal, die Schüler dürfen das lesen, was mir verboten blieb. Da steht ja Wolf Biermann im Regal und andere Weltliteratur. Wie einseitig waren unsere Schuljahre.
There were many forbidden books, which are also seen in the pictures here on the screen. For example, 5 Days in June from Stefan Heim. There are many like things that we smuggled under our clothes. Also like music, West music. In the churches, we sang songs about the environment and the future. And in Berlin, I was shocked to see the double wall that there was. I was there when the wall fell, and at the time, I also was in some places. There was like 5 times, so the border was so big. And later in the West, in 1990, I visited in Sweden a German teacher, and also in those times, I was honestly saddened and shocked to see all those books they were allowed to read, all of the things they could learn that had been forbidden for me to learn in school.
Belogen. Fremdsprachen als Klassenkampf. 7 Jahre Russisch. Englisch, Wahlfach 2 Jahre. Ohne Praxisgelegenheit. Meine Lehrerin treibt es in den Selbstmord, diese Art Unterricht geben zu müssen. Oktober 89, die Montagsmärsche in Leipzig. Erich Löss, Nikolaikirche. Ich wohnte in Leipzig in einer halb verfallenen Straße. Ich war Praktikantin. Angst hatten wir, als wir die Scharfschützen sahen auf den Dächern. Stark fühlten wir uns in der Nikolaikirche. Und wir singen, Sonne der Gerechtigkeit, gehe auf zu unserer Zeit. Das Ganze mit Steffen Ahlisch, der das Buch da oben geschrieben hat. Ich liebe meine Wohnung am Prenzlauer Berg. Es ist die Wohnung eines Geflüchteten. Heulende Freunde bei mir, der eine nach dem anderen geht. 1989, ne? Der eine nach dem anderen geht, aber ich will hier bleiben. Gerade jetzt. Jetzt gibt es neue Chancen zur Erneuerung. Ich bin Wahlhelfer im März 1990. Die ersten freien Wahlen in meinem Leben.
There was also a kind of a fight of sorts in school. When you look at the languages we were learning, we learned so much about the Russian language. But with our English classes, we only learned the theoretical part. We had barely any opportunity to really use it in practice. And my English teacher committed suicide because of that, because this is the way she had to teach the language, and she could not bear that. In October 1989 in Leipzig, I witnessed there were people with guns on the roofs, and we were so afraid of that happening. And those were things that we witnessed like in our normal life. We found a safe place in the church where we sang many songs. I liked my house at the Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, which was a house from people who had fled. And in 1989, around the fall of the wall, more and more friends chose to leave, but I wanted to stay. Thank you very much for your story and also for the pictures you showed us. Our fourth panelist, Jaap Winja. Like Petra, you have also been part of an exchange. Would you like to tell us your story and how this was for you?
Yes, thank you. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here now. Can you click to, I think, the next slide? I don't know exactly how much time is left for me. So I've been changing a few things also in what I thought to say. I tried to tell you a story. And first of all, I also hope there's a lot of students in this room, because this begins when I was a student. In the mid-80s, we had a partner community from Eelde-Paterswolde with the Güstrower Kirche Domgemeinde in Güstrow. October 1985, I was with the first group, 2 cars, 8 young people who traveled from Eelde to Güstrow. We were the third group of our church that went. Summer or even spring 85, we prepared applying for visa. It took a lot of paperwork actually to get into the GDR. This is about what you needed to enter. What you don't see is the actual visa. What you do see is the Antrag auf Einreise in the DDR. This one I more or less wasted. I thought when I hand this in with all the typo typex on it, it won't get through maybe, and I didn't want that to happen. So I made a new one, and I kept this as a souvenir. And this was the one that applied for the first trip that I went single to visit the woman I love. We got some travel instructions, and we got a strict order not to fall in love. So I take this chronologically. We traveled, went to the border, and that took over an hour to pass the border. Then a lot of tower, barbed wire, beams, everything they told us, of course, before, and stuff that you normally see in movies. And that wasn't all of it. We had to report at the police station within 24 hours of entrance of the country, and we had to pay 25 Deutschmark per day that we stayed there. As a student, that's tough. Yeah. The first impression, it was October 85. It wasn't that nice weather, so it was a bit rainy. The villages and the cities we passed were grayish, and the nature, though, was wonderful. And the city centers turned out to be almost all unspoiled and medieval. Yeah, quite different from the Zuiderdiep in Groningen, where once used to be a nice canal. And so, for me, good. One of the first impressions also was for the smell of lignite. For those who don't know that word, that's braunkohle. And for me, a familiar smell, because in my early years, I grew up with a kolenkachel, with the same kind of smell in the, with my parents. So it felt like home. The people we met that evening, it was dark already when we drove into the churchyard, more or less, were warm-hearted. the door of the church opened and light was burning inside. And also, obviously, in the hearts of those people, we got a very hearty welcome. That weekend, we started with the thought we would bring support, but we mostly received more than we brought. Impressive for me was the coffee cup of a pastorin. She had just like that plastic cup that Maria has, and actually like this one. Yeah, this is the kind of cup that we throw away afterwards, right? That cup was already 1.5 years old. It was brought by the first group that went to Güstrow, and she used it for her drinks every day and washed it afterwards as a token. I was also with the Delft Studentenkoor, a wonderful fraternity where you get a lot of challenges and adventures. Not quite comparable with Vindicat. We were tougher. And one of the things we did there, what we thought was fun, was to order a meter of noise. That meant that one of the staff, of the personnel, would go up to the first stock and plate by plate let fall plates into each other, which makes an incredible noise after a certain number of plates. After we came back, I did not like the joke anymore. When I recall life in the GDR, it was what struck was solidarity between people, and also the importance of relationships that you had. Once the car I had broke down and got welded at the workshop of a sugar factory in the weekend by a neighbor. Art of improvising, drawings on train tickets as postcards. Everybody had a job. Almost nobody had a telephone. A letter took a week to arrive. That letter might be opened and read. That often happened to us, or seemed to happen. We used to tape them. Nobody could go to the West, although it could be done when one of your family celebrated a Jubilee birthday, like getting 80 or so. So my mother, now mother-in-law, managed to visit me in Delft due to such a celebration. Yeah, by the way, of course, I fell in love in the first weekend we were there. Stasi, everywhere. The neighbors in the same house my parents-in-law lived. The sexton of the church who gave us our wedding rings. The people that made music at our wedding. We knew that only afterwards. September 5th, 1988, application for family reunification. Yeah, we had to get wed at the Stadthaus in Raadhuis in Güstrow. October 15th, 88, we got wed. October 17th, my father-in-law got fired because of having a first-degree relationship with somebody in the West. So he got fired the Monday after our wedding. On our honeymoon, my wife got a headache when we would visit a supermarket. Even the small supermarket at Schiermonnikoog was for her not really fun because of the large choice between the same kind of products. After the Wende, autumn 89, we bought our first video recorder because of all that was happening. Christmas 89-90, we discussed what would be the best new kind of government for Eastern Germany. March 18th, 1990, Einwehrung. Almost all of my wife's classmates got fired and unemployed in those first years after this happened. A lot of chaos and uncertainty for people who already had jobs or used to have jobs. People from the West claiming old rights, claiming houses that were now inhabited by people from the East. People from the West taking advantage of the situation. March 1990, I saw a lot of Mercedes and BMWs with people with sunglasses, 3-4 men in it with cameras and binoculars, looking for nice sights, especially at Rügen, where I was then. For those people that I knew then, the new world became a tougher world. More freedom, but less social security, especially for those who were over 50 when that happened. Looking now, I see extremes. I see extreme left and extreme right having more place over there. I think it can be explained when you think of a set of scales which was in balance. But then when you change the weights, it will swing a while before it stabilizes again. And I think it will take another generation before that balance is refound. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jaap.
Well, thank you.
And thank you very much to all four of you for sharing your stories, experiences, and views on Germany, both before and after the fall of the wall. I will now give the word back to Florian, who will introduce the second panel, but we would again like to thank all four of you for sharing your story and for joining our panel today.
Thank you so much, Minke, Petra, Maria, and Jaap, for these really fascinating insights, for these very, very personal stories. This is really what this is about, as I said in the beginning, right? I mean, there's the academic perspective on matters, and then there are the true and real life stories that intermix and intermingle as numerous parallels between the stories and the experiences you shared with us. And I'm sure we will connect to these in the further course of today. Unfortunately, as you might have noticed, as I said before, we're on a tight schedule, which is all kind of overshadowed by the fact that this very building in which we are here, and that's clearly a crucial advantage from the online audience in this regard, will be closed at 6 o'clock sharp. And before that, we need to clean up a bit and ask the technicians to rebuild. So therefore, I very warmly thank you once more for these really great, fantastic experiences. And we would indeed continue now immediately with the second panel for today, which will also consist of 3 persons, even though 2 of them will be joining us online. So thank you once more, really. This was really great and precisely at the heart of what we're discussing here. So while we introduce, or while panel 2 comes together here, which actually means on this occasion that the 2 persons being here will be my very dear colleague Vera Alexander and myself. I would like to very warmly welcome our 2 online panelists first. So this second panel will consist of Floor Hanstra, whom I see is joining us online. Hello, and a very warm welcome to you, dear Floor. Floor Hanstra works at NÜFIC, which is an organization that promotes foreign language teaching and better connections between Dutch and German schools. Furthermore, a very warm welcome to you, dear Annette. Annette van Dijk has been working for 20 years as an architectural historian in the municipality of Amsterdam, because her mother is originally from East Germany, and we see especially these cross-family relations that we had, numerous of them in the first panel as well, as really, these are really, of course, primary sources for these individual experiences shared here today. And Annette always had a special bond with this part of Europe for obvious reasons. The wall was still there the first time she visited the GDR on a family visit, again, a parallel to many of the experiences we have heard today. And last but not least, as already announced, my dear and great colleague, Dr. Vera Alexander, is joining us here on site today, who is a senior lecturer here in our program, European Culture and Literature. She's an expert in cultural research and life writing, so also a very fitting topic here for today, I would think. Vera has a German passport, but has been working here in Groningen for 7 years, so another example of those which were mentioned earlier today by Lars Rensmann, of active cross-border labor, so to speak. So welcome to all of you. I will actually now join Vera so that it's a bit more gezellig in front of there. And I would indeed ask our online a colleague, my dear friend and colleague Vera, to start with a brief statement, and then we will move to the online participants.
Lovely. Thank you, Florian. Is this on?
Yes.
No light. Okay. Well, I was born and I grew up in a small town in the green outskirts of Cologne in Western Germany. And it was a very boring small town, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. And in that sense, when I was a teenager, I remember that euphoria of the Berlin Wall falling and us taking a break during the break in school to huddle around the one person that had a car and the car radio, because we didn't have phones or anything else, to catch up on the news. So there was this moment of euphoria. I should also say, I have no relatives that lived in the former GDR. I did, however, have a connection to the East beyond that. So let's include the rest of the so-called Eastern Bloc, because I always perceived this as a very diverse and as a very vibrant cultural scene, because my mother had grown up in Upper Silesia. She left Poland on the day the Berlin Wall was built in '61 to study in Scotland, to visit another emigre relative. And my father did, he had a chair in Eastern European history. So we had a lot of visitors from the Czech Republic and from Poland and from other places. So I never really saw the East in this kind of black and white scheme in which many people perceived it. I remember being bored as a teenager to constantly be asked which Germany I was from. I was abroad. Can't you tell? Right? I'm not locked in. But I was angry because I didn't know enough about the former GDR. So the first thing I did when I was a student was seize on a little research project as part of my pedagogics part of the degree, to investigate what kind of institutions used to be in place in the GDR. And I left with a sense of outrage at how many good things had simply been swept away at the moment of takeover. Because let's face it, reunification is a euphemism for what is actually an annexation. And a lot of the institutions that were mentioned earlier, there were institutions that helped women stay in their jobs because they had childcare. After the moment of the changes, they had to find money for that. There were also innumerable things that made communities more sustainable. So there were a lot of good things in the GDR that I discovered through this little bit of research that were lost in the process. A lot of the things that I could say have been confirmed by Lars Rensmann, including that it still feels very much like you're crossing an invisible border. And I did a workshop in Weimar 3 years ago where I felt relieved when I was back on the part of the motorway of the West, because we were working with migrants, and we had a strong neo-Nazi presence daily patrolling the center where we worked to remind us that this project wasn't entirely welcome. So in that sense, I feel that this idea of German unity was always a bit of a utopian project, because the tensions that were mentioned before and the tensions that were not mentioned. We're not just talking about East versus West. There are all sorts of tensions also between, I suppose, the city versus the country, right? Small town versus large cities, and the constant dynamic tension, I suppose, between the larger political transitions and the quotidian daily life of how we actually manage our lives and how everyday identities are constructed by people everywhere. So I suppose that's where I leave it in the interest of time.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Vera. That was super interesting. I could start discussing with you about this right now, but of course, since you already mentioned, there is a time slot for discussion left. Let's see how much we can actually use it. And obviously, we have two great other panelists who have been patiently waiting online despite the slight time lapse we're in here. So without further ado, I would now hand over to you, dear Flor, if you would like to share your thoughts and observations with us from online.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to share a small personal story with you. In the summer of 1990, so that was shortly after the wall was torn down, my former boyfriend and I went to Poland on his motorcycle. When we were crossing Germany, we went to a camping site to stay the night in former East Germany. It was a camping site in the middle of nowhere. So because there were no restaurants or cafes, we had to cook our own dinner. We went to the camping shop, you know, such a small grocery store for the camping guests to buy stuff for dinner. But there literally was nothing in that store because, so we were told, all the East German products were thrown out, and even fresh products like meat, vegetables, and milk were destroyed. They told us that everybody wanted Western products. No one was buying East products anymore. The only thing they sold in that small supermarket was a giant candy in a plastic bag. In Dutch, we call it een spekje. It's yellow and pink and made out of sugar. This candy was about 1 meter square, the kind that you can buy at a carnival. So we had that for dinner. We were traveling with a motorcycle from the Czech brand Java, and a couple of times the motorcycle just broke down. In all cases, people came up to us asking if we could use their help fixing the bike. With a little tin foil and a couple of rubber bands, it usually started up again. We noticed that people in former East Germany and in Poland also were very handy in fixing things themselves. So my statement is that the inhabitants of the former East European countries were way ahead of their time, practicing sustainability by repairing their possessions. Of course, at that time, people didn't have a choice, but we all have to learn how to be modest and consume less now that we're all in the same global climate boat. That's my story.
Great. Well, thank you so much, dear Flor. Again, this is super fascinating indeed. I mean, the Spekje story would have to hook on to that at some point, right? And I might also hypothesize that maybe nowadays, in the framework of nostalgia, it's no longer the case that Eastern products are of no demand, right? So that was clearly a transitional period. If I'm now visiting Berlin, I mean, you can buy all kinds of supposed Eastern stuff there, right?
Yeah,
super interesting. Thank you very much, dear Flor. Annette, would you also like to share a statement with us?
Yes, of course. I'm very impressed by the stories I heard from the former panel and my panel members, so I want to add my story. It's not a statement, it's merely some personal perceptions as a child and as a grow-up. So yeah, I want to tell you about my first time I went to the GDR. It was because my mother suffered from nostalgia. She and her family fled from the DDR in 1955, before the war was built. So in 1976, we drove to a small town near Leipzig. I remember there was something with the Dutch Secret Service who had asked to bring a telephone book, but I'm not quite sure if that's true. And our car was, of course, carefully searched at the border, and we all had to take our glasses off when we had to report ourselves at the police station. It was Cold War time, after all. And our family visit was merely, for me at least, a travel in time. Streets and buildings were unchanged since World War II, and bullet holes were still there. Old-fashioned stores and shop windows, cars and people's clothes, everything was covered under a grey veil, and the smell of brown coal, all those things were mentioned earlier before. And obviously, these are characteristics of the GDR we will never forget. Well, at that visit, my mother cried for the whole week because everything she had left behind was still there. Not only the aunts and the cousins, of course, but also the family house was untouched. The garden and even the wooden rabbit cage waited for more than 20 years for her return. Obviously, poverty is a great conservator. Another thing that struck me was the omnipresent fear. Fear for the authorities and the Stasi, maybe, since my granduncle was a Geheimnisträger. In retrospect, we realized that for our East German family, our visit was a burden. Well, I can talk about for hours about all these impressions. And then came the 9th of November 1989. For our family, it was a kind of an emotional roller coaster. It started with hope and then disbelief, and at the end, of course, a boundless happiness. And then the start of some discomfort, to me at least, because our time machine went crazy. Cities were restored, factories were closed, cars got colored, and toilet paper became soft. And the Western sameness was rolled out. The former border, our magic mirror to ancient times, was erased. And since that time, every time I go back to that part of Germany, I look for traces, for the scars of the Iron Curtain, which are still visible, Plattenbau, Kopfsteinpflaster, the typical vocabulary, the solidarity and the togetherness, well, the position of women who has been changed, obviously, the culinary specialties, well, basically the tangible and intangible heritage of the DDR. Looking back and looking forward, this heritage is unique and vulnerable and dissonant, of course, but really something to cherish, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Annette. Yeah, I mean, especially with that last thought you just expressed, I think this is a very fitting kind of framework for the panel overall. Obviously, we structured the panel according to the idea behind the project for the citizens conferences, according to generation. And I would, if I was to like spontaneously find a bit of a bracket for this panel, I would think that there is more ambivalence towards the past, right, overall. So Iwona mentioned the reunification being an ideal or a bit of a utopian concept all along, and both you, Flor, and Annette referred to, in one or the other way, to nostalgic, if not visions, then perspectives on the past, so to speak. That notwithstanding, or I would find it very interesting to ask you whether you would consider that there is indeed a generational difference. Now, if we all roughly share the same generation, so we did these framed generation panel setups here. Would you say, or what would you consider to be generational typic in regards to these observations? So from my end, or what I spontaneously came up with here, what I thought I noticed would be that there is much more ambivalence towards personal histories and towards, well, also the greater historical context, so to speak. I don't know how you see it, Vera. You're nodding already. That's a good sign.
Thank you. Yeah, I think from my perspective, there is a bit of a tension going on, a conflict, as it were, between what I know or want to know. So my first initiative was to study, to learn more about this unknown country that was just about to be lost, and the emotional impact of it. And I think what Lars said earlier in his keynote also relates to this, and I can't quite switch off the researcher, of course. So I know that studying affect and studying the emotional components of people's lives, that's becoming a very important branch, because for years and decades and centuries, we focus on the rational, on the cognitive bits, on the bits that can be calculated. But I think what has been shown on the maps that Lars showed earlier, and also in the strong emotional impact that was mentioned by the people from the earlier generation, but also I think our group, is that there is a lot going on between how we feel about the whole thing and how we think about it.
Great. Any comments from you on this thought? I mean, Annette, I also have to ask you about the telephone book, but maybe about another occasion. But maybe you can briefly explain why. What was it about the telephone book precisely?
Got to know.
Well, I don't know if it's a big story my father told us, but he said that he got a call from the Secret Service, and they asked him to bring or take a telephone book, but I rather think that it could be bringing, because in the GDR at that time, I'm not sure if they had a telephone book, but because there were a few telephones, but I'm not quite sure, but that's the big story about our first time to the GDR. I really liked to add something Vera said, because I think our generation, or I, looked from the outside to the people in the GDR and the lives they living there. We were not victims. We could just turn our backs and to the GDR and go further with our lives. So I think that's the a sort of a comfortable position we have. So we can afford ourselves some nostalgia or nostalgia, yeah, I think that's a bit different. The difference between the several generations.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also, if we take into consideration, I was also just made very aware by all the great stories, also from the first panel today, what a massive difference it makes, since back then these kind of media events as we know them today, like everyone knows where they have been at 9/11, even though they weren't in New York, right? So because it was mediated at an entirely different level. So I personally also only remember sitting in front of a rather small TV screen and watching the news about this. So it makes a massive difference if your personal stories are intermixed and intermingled with the history in this regard. Flo, what is your perspective on this generational typical aspect, or with a question mark for now, obviously?
Well, I have to say that all the people in the panels are either German or lived in Germany, and I'm just from that perspective, I was a tourist, and that was also my contribution to this panel. That as being a tourist, you get a glimpse of what the lives of people were like, and so for me, it's a bit difficult to answer that question.
Of course. No, but I think we have a good mix actually of levels of involvement, so to speak. I was rather referring to the question whether you would say that on average is maybe there's maybe a bit of a say a typicality to be found, or typicalities to be found. I just got the signal that we have some 2 minutes left, so I would like to open the floor for maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. As always, both on-site and online is possible. If I see any raised hands here, be it from my great colleague Stein, who's watching the chat. So as always, everyone is welcome online as well. And I see that Annette has actually raised her hand. So please take over, Annette.
Yeah, well, I just discovered the chat function, so I already typed something. But I'm very curious, and I wanted to ask Maria. Are you frustrated about the situation that there was a wall and there was a totalitarian system on the other side, and it was so near, and nobody did anything? Because that was the situation with my mother, that she got really angry about all the politicians, also in the Netherlands, that knew that there was something wrong on the other side on the wall and nobody did anything.
Wat was jouw eerste woord? Are you, wat zei je? Oh, of ik gefrustreerd was. Horen jullie mij?
Ja, oh sorry.
Oh, ja.
Ja.
Ja, natuurlijk waren wij gefrustreerd. Oh, wacht even. Oh. Zal ik het in het Duits doen?
Ja, okay.
Natürlich waren wir frustriert. Wir lebten in einer doppelten Wahrheit. Zu Hause wurde die Wahrheit gesprochen und in der Schule nicht. Man stellt sich darauf ein. Man lebt mit einer sogenannten doppelten Identität. Und darum nannte ich den Zweck Optimismus. Ich reiste viel im Ostblock, weil ich dann reisen konnte mit einer Gruppe, mit allen Kontrollen. Wir hatten internationale Kontakte innerhalb der Kirche. Das war möglich. Sonst hätte ich meinen Mann ja nicht kennengelernt. Natürlich waren wir frustriert, aber wir probierten in der DDR-Situation uns politisch so zu engagieren, dass wir über die Kirche ja, ich würde sagen, einen Beitrag leisten konnten.
All right. Of course, we were frustrated, but that is why I use the term necessary optimism. We were frustrated because we had a double identity. We learned different things in school than we had to think our own thoughts of that. So it really felt like a double identity. And we were allowed to travel in a group with all the controls that she also talked about previously. But we tried to be engaged as much as we could in our own way. And that is why I refer to necessary optimism that we use in that regard.
Well, thank you very much also to you, dear Rachel, for the great translation. And yeah, once more, thank you all for coming and for joining the discussion here. Thanks especially once more to our great panelists, Flor, Annette, and Vera. We will have a quick break. Now, first of all, let's give another applause to our three panelists, of course. We will have a quick break. Now, what time is it precisely, please? 32, excellent. So we will reconvene at 45. So let's have a quick coffee break, everyone, and then we will be back in time schedule. Yay.
All right. After our second break, let us continue with the third panel. For this panel, we have two guests here on site and two guests online. For our guests on site, on the left is Niklas Abel. Niklas grew up near Hamburg in Germany and has lived in the Netherlands since 2018. He is working as a German teacher at the University of Groningen and is also studying the Master Applied Linguistics. His neighbor next to me is Yanniek Witters. Yanniek is very interested in the German language, culture, and literature. He is studying European languages and cultures, specializing in German, and has also been to Germany several times. Welcome. For our guests online, we have joining us Geert de Vries. Geert studied German in Groningen and is now working at a software company in Germany. Since 2015, he has lived in Göttingen in the southeast of the German state of Niedersachsen, which is very close. He has lived very close to the former border that once divided Germany. Welcome, Geert. And our fourth guest today joining us is Brit Scholte-Albers. She is also studying European languages and cultures, specializing in German in Groningen, like Yanniek. Welcome to all four of you. Glad you could join us here. In this panel, for the four of you, a united Germany has always been normal. It has always been the norm, and you grew up with a united Germany. How do you see this, we wonder? What is your perspective on Germany now? And like both from a Dutch, and in your case, from both Dutch and German perspective. Niklas, would you like to start with your view?
Sure. Does this work? Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. Okay. Well, as was already mentioned in the beginning, I cannot help with the Dutch perspective on a reunified Germany, but I can give some insights, at least from my context, into the reunified Germany from inside the nation itself. I grew up in northern Germany with really just like Dr. Alexander with barely any affiliations to Eastern Germany. My parents were born and raised in Western Germany, and their parents. So the history of territorial division was not as present in my home as it was probably in households that were more directly affected by the separation and the reunification processes. And the first time that I became aware of the former separation was, I think it was around 11, and when I took a good look at my desk mat, one of those, I don't know if they still exist, these mats that you use to protect your desk from scratches when you write on them. I don't know if that's still a thing, but mine happened to be a map of Europe, and I was around 11, and I took a good look, and there it was, the Iron Curtain, and the two separately labeled nations that I had learned of as one nation in geography class. And I went to my mother and I asked for clarification, and she was happy to provide them. And maybe I should say this: that map was handed down from my brothers. I'm the youngest of 4 children, and my brothers were all born in the 80s. So it was a relict of older times when the nations were still separated. It wasn't a political agenda by my parents to reinforce the division even in the 2000s. So before you get a wrong impression of my parents. Yeah, that was the first moment that kind of brought that process of awareness of separation, of the German separation, into motion. And in hindsight, it's kind of striking that it happened so late in my life, I think. And I believe the same goes for the majority of my generation and for the generations after mine. And my view on the reunified Germany is actually critical, and I'm going to shamelessly tap into what has already been said by Professor Rensmann and also by Dr. Alexander beforehand. And I'm not critical on the process that it actually happened, the reunification that happened, but how it took place. And I am becoming more and more aware of the mistakes that have been made. Again, the mistakes that we have talked about earlier, the mistakes that practices of community forming have been lost, practices of sustainability have been lost. And I try to integrate those mistakes of the reunification process into my opinion forming, because I catch myself taking the very easy route many times. We've just talked about me coming from a very privileged generation, growing up in complete freedom in circumstances that are unprecedented when you look at the European history. And it's so easy for me to have an opinion. It's so easy to me to scold Eastern Germans for xenophobic uproars against refugees that seek help. It's so easy for me to shake my head at increasing affiliation with, how do I put this, with reactionist political actors. And the more I get aware of, the more I become aware of the process of the way the reunification has unfolded and is still unfolding, the more I can, if not understand, I can conceptualize what is happening and to a degree why it is happening in Eastern Germany. The more I know, the more I wonder if the underlying issues and that wall in our head will ever cease to exist. But again, tapping into what Professor Rensmann has said, if we look at current polls, younger generations tend to use that West German, East German divide less and less in their identification process, in the construction of their identity. So maybe that cleavage is less unbridgeable than it seems at times. And yeah, who knows, maybe we're in for the happy end at long last. Who knows?
Thank you very much for sharing your view and also your critical outlook on this, Niklas. Yanniek, you have been to Germany several times. You are studying German now, and you live in the Netherlands. Could you share us your view and your interests?
Well, for my generation, for our generation, is it of course a bit harder to imagine what it was like to have two Germany's actually, and to see the struggle between two huge ideological power bases. So that was actually what I thought about. And last week, Angela Merkel, of course, retired as Bundeskanzlerin of Germany that has been unified for 30 years, 31 years now. And in addition to the very likely assumption that Merkel's farewell will have on both Germany and Europe, her Amt also stressed Merkel's political career as a politician whose roots can be found in East Germany, GDR, and Merkel's choice of the song Du hast den Pfadfind vergessen by GDR punk singer Nina Hagen was of course quite remarkable. I don't think anyone would expect that. Was this a reference to her East German roots and therefore probably a form of nostalgia? Or was it a case of Merkel's sense of humor kicking in? But the unity of Germany is, yes, a certainty from a generation. And as I said, we did not experience the great struggle between the two large power bases, between capitalism actually and Marxism, Leninism. And the disappearance of the GDR also marked the disappearance of an ideological counterpart to the system we actually have become used now. Yeah, in any case, well, what we can say about Merkel, I think, is that it shows a bit the normality of an East German leader, of an unified Germany, though also without forgetting the past. For my generation, for those born after unification, yeah, the vision of Germany and reunification is actually something that, yeah, can be found in history books, or that mainly revolves around the legacy of the GDR and about nostalgia. So in other words, the German reunification is actually a bit more accepted or seen as natural, as normal. Well, this is what it feels to me. But I thought about it, is it actually normal that we live in a system that is marked by ideology, and we don't think much about it because there is no big struggle between multiple ideologies. So is it the self-evidence which we now are so familiar? It reminds me also of the widespread change in the GDR, because the GDR needed to go to another system. In the course I took last year on German unification, made me also realize that what is considered as normal or appropriate is a very subjective representation of the truth. Our everyday lives, our lifestyles, and even our education are not free of ideological interpretations. So I thought, when we think about this, the world we live in seems no longer so self-evident. And in fact, I think this is the moment when we can realize that we find ourselves also confronted with this reality. So what I wanted to say above all is that we as a generation, we only know a reunified Germany. So it is also hard to imagine the influence of ideology on the country, actually.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, Yanniek. It is interesting to see the similarities between your stories, as in that both of you are saying, it's easy to be critical when you're in a perspective that's so privileged, and it's sometimes hard to imagine that things were different because they were so normal to you. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts here as well. Geert, one of our online guests. Niklas has lived in Germany and then moved to the Netherlands. You, on the other hand, have lived in Groningen, in the Netherlands, then moved to Germany. Would you tell us how this has affected your view of Germany and how you see these things?
Well, growing up as a kid, I didn't really was aware of the fact that Germany was divided. But I do remember, and I don't really know why, that I saw a documentary at primary school. It was about the fall of the Berlin Wall and was I guess it was like 15 years ago at that time. So it must have been around 2004. And it kind of made an impression on me because I can still remember it. And that was the first time that I really got to know that Germany was divided. And before that, I wasn't really aware of the fact that there were two Germanys in the past, because I just thought Germany is close to the Netherlands. That was like normal to me. And I visited Berlin when I was about 16 years old. That was with my brother. And then I first saw evidence of the fact that Germany was divided. I saw parts of the Berlin Wall, Checkpoint Charlie, and I also saw the watchtowers. And after high school, I studied German, and we talked about differences between East and West, and North and South, and we talked about the fact that maybe there is no difference anymore, or the difference is not as strong, as big as the difference between North and South Germany, that's becoming more of a difference. And for my studies, I moved to Göttingen, which is actually in the center of Germany, not that far away from the former inner German border. It's about like 30 kilometers away. The border crossing point, Duderstadt-Worbis, is really close. And I actually moved to Göttingen on October 3rd, which is Day of German Unity. And I was warned by my international student buddy that I had to bring groceries or do groceries in the Netherlands before I would come to Germany, because all the stores would be closed. And I was a bit surprised, actually, to find out that on that day, like, no one is really celebrating, because I thought it's a national day here in Germany. So I thought it would be like King's Day, but I didn't really see people partying or doing anything celebrating that day. It was just like all stores are closed. Yeah, and I got to know more division of people here in Germany, and I learned that a lot of people still have like prejudice about people from Eastern Germany. There is a region close to Göttingen, which is called Eichsfeld, and one part used to be in the former GDR, and one part used to be in West Germany. And when someone tells, or when a person is from that region, they always tell, I'm from the Western or from the Eastern part. Like, there is still some kind of difference between those two parts of the Eichsfeld. And in addition, when you talk about the division of Germany with Germans, you get to hear stories about them going to the GDR and strict border checks. But there are also like funny stories of West Germans who traveled from Eastern Germany back to West Germany, and they well, a friend actually told me that his father and uncle traveled in a car from East to West Germany to smuggle alcohol. And they had done some work on the rear seats to put a lot of bottles of alcohol in it. And they were really scared that the East German border patrol would find out that they had alcohol, but everything was not discovered by the border patrol. But also when I speak to colleagues, for example, they told me that they saw a lot of German cars after the Wende, that a lot of small Trabants were riding, were seen in West Germany, which was like something new and yeah, something that was noticed. And also, for example, during lunch break with my colleagues, Well, some of them are from the GDR and some from West Germany. And I think the division is still in the heads of the people here because they make fun about it. For example, some jokes about the people in Eastern Germany, they could not get all products as people in West Germany. But there are also still a lot of prejudices regarding people in Eastern Germany, which I wasn't really aware of before I moved to Göttingen. For example, that a lot of people in Eastern Germany like FKK as a naturism, and that they have a funny accent. And the people in Western Germany always tell me things like that. But in the media, you also see that the difference between West and Eastern Germany is still emphasized. For example, that the vaccination rates are now lower in Eastern Germany. And for example, I think it was last week that protesters with torches gathered in front of the house of the health minister of Saxony. And with the new government, with Bundeskanzler Scholz being in office now, they mentioned, for example, that there were only 2 ministers from Eastern Germany. So it's still something which plays a role in the minds of the German people. Yes.
Thank you very much, Geert, for sharing your story as well and for giving insights into the perspective of someone who is from the Netherlands, currently living in Germany. Our fourth panelist, Brit, welcome to you as well. Like Yanniek, you're also studying European languages and cultures, specializing in German. Would you tell us how you look at this this question and how you view this?
Yes. Yeah, for me, a united Germany is obviously normal. And because I was born after the reunification, I had to learn most things from history books or films, for example. My parents watched the fall of the wall live on television, so they could tell me about it. My grandmother, also could tell me a lot about it, but still, I learned about it in school. So that, I didn't know immediately that there had been 2 Germanys. And 2 years ago, I was in Berlin, and that made the influence of the division clearer for me. Of course, I saw the remains of the wall, but I also went to museums. And I think this gave me a good idea of what life must have been like then. But despite these things, I still find it rather difficult to imagine how this division in real life must have been. I find it hard to imagine that a country can be divided into, or that even a city can be separated by a wall. For me, I think it's difficult because I didn't actively experience the reunion. And you can just travel free inside Germany. I've also been to the former east of Germany, and I noticed that there still are some differences. So I think even though our generation didn't grow up with a divided Germany, we can still see some traces of this division. I live close to the German border, and ever since I was little, I visited Germany for shopping, eating out, or days out. This is mainly in the northern border area, but there are many places that actually really count on the Dutch people. And on a larger scale, as we mentioned before today, both countries are important trading partners. And I think this shows that the relations between both countries have changed from what they used to be. And yeah, for me, they are actually good, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Britt, and thank you to all four of you for sharing your statements and your views. I'm curious, is there anyone who has a question on site or online, or does either of you have a question to one of the other panelists? Go ahead, Minke.
What's his name? Yanniek, because you said Merkel had a remarkable choice to choose Nina Hagen. But did you know Nina Hagen is the daughter of Wolf Biermann? He was a very important person, a writer and also a singer in the GDR. And he was banned from the DDR to West Germany, and he was always protesting and critical of the GDR. So it's not so very strange he chose Nina Hagen, though. So there is a connection with that. Did you know that? Because I didn't know that as well, and I read it yesterday accidentally.
I didn't know. I already heard of Biermann, but I did not know that she was. They were connected actually.
Yeah, his daughter.
Yeah.
So and then I could understand the choice of her better.
Thank you for your question and addition, Minke. We have time for one last question, online, on site, or addition by either one of you in the panel. Florian.
Maybe then I can close with absolutely loved Niklas, your little story with the map here on your desk at home when you were a child. And we also saw earlier in the second keynote by Jacco Pekelder, we saw this wonderful drawn map of Europe from the 19th century, which was a bit controversial, obviously, not only from today's perspective. So I was generally reminded of the power that these imageries just have on us. Like, so before you had any kind of discursive knowledge about it from what you told, right? You just made a visual discovery, so to speak, which is, of course, by means of a cultural product, right? I mean, a map is highly culturally determined. There's a whole subdivision on cultural studies on this. So I very much like this kind of history pointing at, or rather history or historical knowledge or historical consciousness rather actually evolving from a bit of a cultural, or from quite a cultural artifact indeed, which is, as it happens quite often. So that would for me be kind of the common, if not denominator, but maybe a common or returning pattern, if we now speak of this generational issues, that we need more and more cultural artifacts or cultural productions of some sorts that can actually communicate this part of history, so to speak. I mean, we had a number of good series, even good German series, which is really a seldom thing, right, on this matter. So Germany, Deutschland, 83, 86, 89, for instance, it was quite entertaining, I found. So we need more and more this kind of cultural backup, so to speak, I think, to keep this part of history alive. That seemed to me like for all the panelists more or less referred to some cultural patterns that made them actually deal with this part of history in the first place, right? Super interesting. Yes, please go ahead.
Can I'd just like to react to that, because I do agree that these kind of physical representations of the past are very important, especially to the new generations that grew up without actually perceiving what has happened during the territorial division. But at the same time, I feel like the representations, at least the representations that I am aware of, like Checkpoint Charlie and Palast der Tränen in Berlin, they all represent just this very the negative bits of the German separation, whilst, as we have already discussed, there were bits in the Eastern German culture, in the cultural organization, that are worth reviewing and actually worth reviving, that really lack physical representation or intellectual representation, actually, because I didn't think of community practices or sustainability practices that we are looking for right now, where we can maybe find an answer in the Eastern German history. And I wasn't really aware of them until we talked about them today. So I think whilst it is important to reinforce the negative experiences by points like Checkpoint Charlie, we really are in terrible need of positive representation of what was actually good in Eastern Germany, right?
Thank you very much for your addition, Niklas. And with that, I would like to conclude the last panel. Thank you very much to all four of you for sharing your views and your thoughts and different perspectives. And also thanks to all of the panelists who are here today to share with us their many stories and memories and reflections on this topic.
And a very special thanks to you, dear Rachel, once more for the wonderful moderation. So now we come to the very last, but nevertheless super, super important and interesting item for today, namely kind of continuing the generational order we have established from the beginning of the second block of today's event. We are now ending up with the product of one of our courses, one of our bachelor courses here, which is entitled German Culture and Literature 1, because there are several of these. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to all of you Yanniek Moll and Geanne Kroes, who are joining us online today, because actually they're currently on their Erasmus semester abroad in Hamburg, so they're joining us from Germany. And they and their fellow students have produced in the course of this module, a poster, which is in turn based on presentations they have done on different aspects of German reunification, also and including from a Dutch perspective. And what could be a better thing to close this wonderful event here today with than have a look at this poster and having Yanniek and Geanne guide us through it. So please take over, Yanniek and Geanne, and thank you for joining us from Hamburg tonight.
Thank you. Just give us a minute to share the poster online. Yes, so I hope you all can see it right now.
Works.
Yes, okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone. We are Geanne and Yanniek, and today at this conference, we have the pleasure to present the poster that we made as part of our project. And yeah, you all see the post here on your screen. And for those of you who are lucky enough to be live in Groningen, I believe that our poster is also in the rooms, which means that you can take a closer look at it after our presentation. So like Florian already mentioned, last summer semester during the course German Literature and Culture, we worked together with our fellow German language students on the project German Unity from 1990 to 2021, perspectives from the University of Groningen. So the 9 students of our course each worked in pairs on a part of this project, and the most important findings of the 5 sub-projects have been put together in this beautiful poster.
Yes. And as you all know, on the 9th of November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and the process of German unification began. Event in German history, due to the elections in the Netherlands, which had taken place shortly before, it took a relatively long time before an official reaction from The Hague came. Like other foreign leaders, Prime Minister Ruud Lubbers was skeptical about German unification from the beginning, and even more so after the actual fall of the wall on the 9th of November. Like him, many Dutch politicians stressed that they were in favor of establishing freedom and democracy, but were critical regarding reunification. However, as the process progressed, greater acceptance in Dutch politics emerged. Among the Dutch population, there also was a dual image of positivity and criticism, which we discovered by analyzing newspaper articles. The reason why we have chosen newspapers is because newspapers do not only reflect a representative image of current developments, but they can also exert an influence on these developments. Thus, they do not only reflect current events, but at the same time, they also influence the way people form their opinions.
Yes, and as this analysis shows, that it showed that the German unification was a much discussed topic in all the Dutch newspapers, and this started mainly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we found out that the initial reactions were characterized by sympathy for East Germans and East Germany, but also by confusion and uncertainty about the future of Germany and Europe. But as the process of reunification progressed, the positive attitudes towards the German unity declined. And then also several interviews with citizens of Groningen conducted by one of our fellow students correspond with the outcome of this newspaper analysis. And we have put two interesting quotes taken from the interviews on our poster. And the first one states, "In my environment, it was thought that a unified Germany would not only be good for the economy, but also for German culture, for example." And the other one is, "I have wondered whether the reunification did not come too quickly for the GDR residents at the time. The GDR had to adapt to the FRG in a short period of time, and in my opinion, some extra time would have been needed to overcome these differences." So as you can see, the reactions of the citizens in Groningen are striking examples of the dual image presented among the Dutch population.
And our project also examined the current cultural relations between Groningen and Germany. For example, just like in other European cities, stolpersteinen can be found in Groningen. And these represent the legacy of the post-war peace that reunified Europe and set us on a trajectory of cooperation and solidarity. In addition, Groningen has 3 partner cities in Germany: Hamburg, Oldenburg, and Bremen. Groningen collaborates with these partner cities in a variety of areas. The university also has a strong affinity with the German language and culture. For example, the Grimm und Kluge Society, of which we were both part last year, represented the German language and culture at the university. Since this academic year, since September, Grimm und Kluge has been part of the umbrella study association, Asperia,
which is the study association of our course, European Languages and Cultures. And then finally, we also dealt with literary testimonials on the GDR, because after all, a literature course is not really complete without an extensive book analysis. And the book that was chosen is Meine freie deutsche Jugend by Claudia Rusch. And this book is one of the most popular Selbstzeugnisse of German unification. And in this book, too, a Dutch perspective on German unification is briefly discussed. For example, in this quote, "My Dutch boyfriend was not interested in the difficulties between the newly reunited East and West Germans. He liked to state that for someone from the Netherlands, all Germans were East Germans. Sometimes I laughed about this. Sometimes I tried to explain to him that the GDR had not simply disappeared. It still lived within me. It did not allow me to take things for granted."
So, all in all, it can be concluded that the Dutch perspective on German unification was characterized by a dual image of criticism and positivity. We are very much looking forward to the conference in Dresden this summer, where we will be able to compare our Dutch perspective and our poster with other European countries. So we would like to thank you for your attention, and we hope you'll have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Well, Thanks so much to the both of you, Yanniek and Geanne. I hope you could hear the applause here, which is very well earned for the both of you and for your fellow students as well, because as you pointed out, this poster was really a co-creation and a wonderful one, and also good proof for what we just discussed in the context of the last panel, that it's all the more important nowadays to create in order to remember. So that was really a brilliant example for this. And with this, we conclude this conference. Thank you both for setting this very, very fitting final point of this whole event. I would like to extend my thank yous to all the speakers of today, to our keynote speakers. I see that Professor Jacco Pekelder has joined us the whole afternoon. A very special thanks to you, dear Jacco. Thank you to the other keynote speaker, Professor Lars Rensmann. Thanks to Pablo Valdivia, to all the panelists that have so wonderfully presented their individual views, their individual stories. We could discover numerous interconnections and synergies between them. And last but not least, thanks to my great colleagues, Rachel and Stein, who have been co-organizing this with me and without whom this would have not been possible. And last but not least, thank you also, a big thank you to our two great technicians in the background who have also joined basically the whole day, spent the whole day in this very room here. That has to be mentioned as well. So special applause to you guys. Well, we have kind of a routine of wishing each other to stay healthy these days. So I repeat this kind of routine on this occasion. Everyone stay healthy, stay sound and well, and good way home to everyone who has been here. Thank you all for joining us, especially once more the online audience, and have a good Friday night.